In this video, I'm going to teach you exactly how to create your own on-demand food delivery app, just like Uber Eats, without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Now, before I say another word, let's dive in and take a quick preview of what we're going to be building today. Over in a preview of my application here, I'm currently logged in as a user, and as you'll see on our homepage, we can scroll between all of the different types of food categories. If we wanted, we could search for a restaurant by its name. And if we were to just start scrolling through our homepage, we can see a list of all of the restaurants that are nearby our current location. Now look, let's say I'm interested in ordering something from La Pasta in San Francisco here. I'm going to click on that and it's going to send me through to the dynamic restaurant page. And so now on this restaurant page, I can view a list of all of the different food items that are served here. And if I was to keep on scrolling down, I could see a list of all of the different reviews that have been published for this restaurant. Now let's start to get a little crazy here and add a couple of different items to my cart. I'm going to select on Mama's Lasagna. And look, your boy's feeling pretty peckish. So I'm going to add 2 of these to my cart. Then I might grab myself a garlic bread. And I'll even treat myself here to a vegetable pizza because of course I'm on a diet right now. Then from here, we're going to scroll on up to the top of our page, click on our checkout. And as I can see, I have an open cart here at La Pasta and I have 3 items added into that cart. So when I click on this, it's going to take me through to a dedicated checkout page. And over on this page, I can review a list of all of the items added into my cart. I can of course choose to remove items, or I could even update the quantity of what I'm going to purchase. But look, for the time being, I'm quite happy with this order. And I can see it's going to cost me $47 in total. So I'm going to select to purchase this. It's then going to redirect me through to a Stripe checkout, from which I can choose to pay with this. It's going to then process that payment. And then finally, once that payment has been successfully processed, it's going to send me through to an activity page where I can see a list of all of my past orders, as well as keep track of the status of my current order. Now look, if I was to switch things up and log into an account as a restaurant owner, you'll see on this page here that I can view a list of all of my restaurant listings. And within each listing, I can choose to edit the details of it, view it, or even manage my orders. And so if I was to quickly just select the edit button, it's going to send me through to another page. And on this page, I can update all of the details about this restaurant. So things like the address, the category, the logo, and even the featured image. But more importantly, if I scroll on down, I can see a list of all of the food items that I've listed. And of course, I can make changes to these here, or even select to add in a new food item. But if I was to revert back to the previous page, what I'm going to do is select to manage the orders for my La Pasta restaurant, because I can see I've got 2 incoming orders. So I'm going to click this button here and it's going to send me through to another page. And on this page, as you'll see, we've got 2 orders that need to be catered to. So for my second order, I'm going to select to view this here. It's going to open this up and display all of the food items that I need to prepare. Now, as I start working on these, I'm going to mark these as in progress. And then let's say I've worked my magic in the kitchen and I'm ready for this to be picked up by a delivery driver. I'm going to mark this as ready for delivery, and now you'll see it's searching for a driver. Now finally, if I was to log into my application as a delivery driver, what you'll see is that we have our own separate dashboard here, which we can now view a list of all of the incoming orders that we can collect. And of course, these are incoming orders within my local area. So let's say I want to choose to accept this last order at the bottom of our page here. I'm going to select to accept this order. It's then going to redirect me through to another page. And over on this page, it's going to display the full details of this order. So I can view both the pickup location and the delivery address. And if I really wanted, I could choose to zoom into my map to see exactly where I need to take this to. Now, once I've delivered this food item, I can also choose to mark this as delivered, and that will update the status of that order throughout my entire application. Now look, this was just a handful of the features I've created within my app today. There's still just so much happening behind the scenes to make this entire app functional. If you've ever tried to build your own app or startup, I'm sure you know firsthand just how hard it can be to bring your vision to life. If you're a non-technical person, just like this guy, finding a developer to actually build your app can just be downright expensive or difficult to do. Now that is why Bubble is going to be your new best friend on your startup journey. Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means that you can build fully functional apps without having to touch a single line of code. I've used Bubble to build pretty much any app you could think of under the sun, and it just truly blows my mind with what you can build using the toolset. Bubble not only allows you to create your own custom database, but it allows you to design the interface of your app, stitch everything together and make it functional using visual workflows, And then finally, it also gives you the ability to integrate with third-party tools and services. Now, if you were to look at other no-code tools, each one of these features would be a standalone tool. So it's truly just insane that Bubble includes all of that in one single platform. Look, by this point, I've rambled on for far too long, so let's just jump right in and we can start building out our product. Within our course today, the first thing I wanted to cover wasn't actually building out any core user-facing features, but instead I just wanted to take the time to set up and configure our own custom database. Now, the reason why we're going to focus on building out our database first is because our database is going to be used to power the rest of our Uber Eats clone today. So it's super important we set this up and get this right from the beginning because it's going to help streamline the entire rest of our build. Now, within our tutorial today, I've gone ahead and I've created a checklist that just outlines all of the different data types and fields that we're going to add into our database. And of course, I'm going to be sure to explain each of these as we add it into our own Bubble editor. But I've also included a long list of all of the features that we're going to add out throughout our build. And as you can see, this is quite an extensive list. There's so much that I want to cover. Now, this checklist was just created in a tool called Notion. And what I love about Notion is that it gives you the ability to check items off as you add it into your Bubble editor. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do today. It's just going to help me keep track of where I am. And of course, it'll also help you follow along. Now, I'm going to be sure to include a link to this checklist in the description of this video. So that way you can make a duplicate version of this and follow along yourself. But this is something I like to do for any product that I build in Bubble. Now, when it comes to setting up our own custom database in Bubble, there's two key things you need to understand. And that is the difference between data types and data fields. And so what are each of these things? As you'll see in my checklist here, I have these headings at the top of each individual checklist. And these headings are my data types. So a data type is an overall thing or entity that will be created in your database. And then within each data type, you have your data fields. So these are all of my checklist items here. And your data fields are the information you'll store under each data type. And look, I completely get it. The explanation I've probably just given you makes absolutely no sense, and that is completely fine. But the way I like to understand both of these core concepts is that when you think about your application before you even build anything out, it's important to think about what features you want to add into your app. So if we're building something like Uber Eats, users should be able to do things like register accounts, create restaurants, list food items for each restaurant, and then of course create things like orders and process payments. And so because we have a good idea of exactly what kind of features we want to build out within our product, what we can do before we even touch our Bubble editor is think about how all of this is going to be stringed together. And this is where you'll format your data types and your data fields. And so when it comes to an overall data type, if a user ever needs to create something in your application, this will be a data type. So for instance, I have a user data type here because users are going to need to create user accounts. I also have a restaurant data type because if someone wants to list a restaurant listing, they're going to need to create a restaurant. Then inside of each restaurant, people are going to need to be able to list food items for sale. So that's why my food item is a separate data type. And what you'll then notice is that for each of these data types, I'm storing information about each thing that's going to be created. So for our user data type, every single time someone registers an account, I'd like to know some information about them. So things like their name, their profile photo, and their account type. So are they a delivery driver? Are they a restaurant owner? Or perhaps they're just someone that wants to order food. And so that is the core difference between both your data types and your data fields. And as I've mentioned, your boy's done the hard work for you today. And I've already built out all of the different data types and fields we'll need to add in. And as I actually add these into Bubble, I'm going to be sure to explain why each one of these fields is important and how it's going to play a role within our Uber Eats clone today. And so in order to build out our database, we're going to jump straight into a brand new Bubble editor here. I haven't made a single change to this. And if I was to open up my data tab here, the first thing you'll notice is that on the left-hand side, we're viewing all of our data types. And then on the right-hand side, when you select a data type, this is where you'll see all of your data fields. So each one of these line items is a different data field. But I'm sure this probably raises another question for you, and that is, why on earth is our user data type already created for us? Well, the reason for this is because in order for someone to actually use your application, in most scenarios, they're going to need to create an account in order to do so. And so that's why Bubble adds a user data type by default. And what you'll notice is that under your user data type, you'll have a couple of different fields here that are already created. And one of those is the email. And the reason why Bubble adds the email field in is because whenever someone signs up an account, they're going to need an email and a password. So that way they can use those credentials to later on log back into that account. Now, Bubble also does provide a password field by default, but you just won't be able to view this here for security reasons, but it is there. And now when it comes to the process of building out our database, before we add any of the data fields under our user data type, what we're going to need to do first is add in all of our separate data types. And the reason why I do this first is because, as you'll soon see in a moment, there will be some data fields that link to separate data types, so you can share information between different data. And don't worry, I'm going to be sure to explain that once we get to that point. But before we do that, we're going to need to add in all of our different data types. So within my checklist here, we have our user data type, which is already added in. Then we have our restaurant data type. Now, the reason why I've created this restaurant data type is because, as I mentioned before, if someone wants to list their restaurant on Uber Eats, they're going to need to be able to actually create a restaurant. So that is why this is its own data type. So I'm going to type in the word restaurant. I'll then choose to create this here. Then we can grab our next data type, which is a food item. And the purpose of this, as the name would suggest, is if anyone owns a restaurant and they'd like to list a food item, they're going to need to actually create a food item in our database. So this is also going to be a data type. So I'm going to call this food item and I'll add that in. We'll then jump back over into my checklist. And the next thing we're going to do is add in a data type for our checkout items. And so with this data type, whenever someone adds an item to their checkout, I'll want to actually create an item that's stored in a user's checkout. And within this item, we're going to store information about like what food item someone's purchasing, the total quantity of how many of those food items they want, as well as things like the total cost. But we'll get to that in a moment. But right now, I just want to add this data type into my database. So I'm going to call this the checkout item. We'll then choose to create that. We'll jump back into my Notion checklist. And the next thing we'll add in is going to be an order. So whenever someone wants to actually purchase an item, we're going to create a new order in our database. So this is just going to create a record of a transaction. So back in our database here, we're going to add another data type called order. We'll jump back into Notion, scroll on down, and the last data type I'd like to add in is going to be our review. So let's say if someone purchases some items from a restaurant and they absolutely love the restaurant, or perhaps they even hate it, it's important that they're able to give a review for this restaurant so that way they can share their feedback. And of course, we'll display this review on a restaurant's profile page later on. But each time someone submits a review for a restaurant, we're going to create a new entry in our database for each review. So if we jump back over into Bubble, I'm going to create another data type called review. And one thing I should also just quickly point out is that, as you'll see here, when it comes to all of our data types, you'll notice that I've never once used a plural. So although in our database, we're going to store multiple reviews. So people are going to list hundreds or thousands of reviews for all of the restaurants within our app today. But it's important to just notice that I haven't spelt this as reviews with an S, so a plural. And the reason for that is because a user will only create one review at a time. They're not going to create multiple reviews at once. So that's why each item that's created in our database is going to be a singular thing. And the reason I just point this out is because if you were to add an S on this, later on when you start to actually reference data types in your Bubble app, it just looks very confusing when there's a plural. And you'll see why later on when we actually build out some of our pages. But for the time being, that is all of the data types we'll need to add into our database. At this point, we're making great progress. If I just jump back into my Notion checklist though, before we go ahead and add in all of our data fields under our data type, there is one last thing I just need to cover. And just when you thought you were starting to get the hang of building out a database in Bubble, I'm going to bring you right back down to earth, because this is where I'm going to introduce what's known as option sets. Now, if you're brand new to Bubble, I do not expect you to understand what option sets are. But of course, it is my job here to explain those in as much detail as possible. So option sets in Bubble are a slightly more advanced feature. And the best way to explain them is by comparing them to data types. So if you remember, when it came to our data types, I mentioned that you should always create a data type whenever your users are going to create something in your database. But what happens if we, as the admins of our application, want to pre-create some data that's stored in our database that only we can edit, not our end users? This is exactly what an option set is for. An option set is like a pre-existing data type where you can control all of the information inside of it. Now, why would you want to do that? In some instances, what you'll just find is that it's better for your users not to have control. Because when your users create entries in your database, there's no telling if they're going to add typos, duplicate versions of things. And so that's why it's important for you to have control over certain aspects. And a great example is the profile types. So if you remember before, I mentioned when we were building out our user data type that we would eventually go on to store an account type for each user. So this will help us determine if a user is, let's say, a delivery driver, a restaurant owner, or a consumer who's just going to purchase food items. Now, if we allowed our users to type in whatever option they wanted for their account type, it wouldn't surprise me if users go on to think that they're more important than they truly are, and they might make themselves like an admin of your application. Or if someone was to say that they want to be a delivery driver, they might add a typo in it. And so that just wouldn't create a consistent experience for this particular field here. And so that's why if we were to scroll on down, we can create our own option set and list out all of the 3 options that someone should be able to choose from. So we, as the admin of our application, are the only person who can edit these values here. So that means that when a user goes on to register an account, within a drop-down menu, we're going to display these 3 options. So someone can only select from a delivery driver, a consumer, or a restaurant owner. And each option that's selected will be spelled the exact same. So we're not going to have any typos or any duplicate versions. And so this is the power of option sets. If you ever need to display something like a list of items for your users to select from, I'd always recommend putting it into an option set list. And so these are options that already exist. We don't want our users to create their own. And you'll notice I've also done it for my categories here. So these are the categories that all of our restaurants can be grouped by. And look, when it comes to option sets, if you were to jump over to your bubble editor, within your data tab, at the top menu here, you'll notice you have something called option sets. And this is where you can add those in. Now, by all means, if option sets still don't make a ton of sense to you, there is this great tutorial that you can watch here. I promise you that my feelings won't be hurt if you watch another video. But for the sake of my guide today, I'm going to skip this tutorial. And what you'll now notice is that on the left-hand side, we have the ability to create an option set, which kind of looks like the process of creating a data type. And so what I'm going to do today is add in my first option set, which was my account types. Now, when I work with option sets, I will include a plural in the name here. So you'll see that I've added an S. And the reason for that is because I am creating a list of items at once. So this is technically a list of values. But just again, to reiterate, I won't do it for my data types, just my option sets. Now, as you saw within my Notion checklist, I have 3 different options I'd like to add in here. There is, first of all, our delivery driver. So I'm going to head on to Bubble and add a new option in. So I'm going to call this delivery driver. Then there was our consumer. And then finally, there was our restaurant owner. And so these are the 3 options that someone can select from. And once again, these kind of look like data fields within our overall data type. And that's because these options kind of are like the data stored within our option set. So you can see that it's a very similar process. But the thing to remember is that this is data that's already stored in your database. And of course, only you can create it. The next thing I'd just like to add in though, so I'm just going to check these options off, is my option set list for my categories. So I'm going to jump back into Bubble here. I'm going to add a new option set list called categories because I'm going to add a list of categories here. And when it comes to my list, I've just got these listed out here. Look, I'm only going to add in a few categories today for the sake of our tutorial. I don't want you to have to sit there and watch me for 10 minutes type in all of the different categories. So I'm just going to quickly add in a few examples here. But by all means, if you want to add a more extensive list, you can always pause this tutorial and take the time to do that. But my first category is going to be alcohol. So I'm going to add this in. I'll hit enter. Then there was seafood. Then there was a category for pizza. There was one for burgers. Then there was the Thai category. And finally on my list, I had the Chinese category. And so these are obviously all of the different types of categories of foods that people can search for restaurants by. And once again, whenever a restaurant creates a listing and they choose their relevant categories, they'll only be able to choose from my exact list here, which means that later on my search results page, if I ever want to display all of the restaurants that sell pizza or are related to a pizza category, If a user selects my option and my option only, all of my restaurants will be categorized under that one option. And so once again, that is the power of option sets. Now look, that's everything we'll need to add for our option sets. So I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick those off. Now the reason why I added my option sets in before my data types is because, as I mentioned before, within our data types, our data fields will actually link to the option set list. So it's important to build those out before we can then go ahead and reference them. Now, thankfully, it's at this point in time that we can build out all of the data fields under our data types. And the very first one is going to be for our user data type. So every single time someone registers an account, as I mentioned before, I'd like to store some information about that person. And that's going to include their name, a profile photo, and their account type. So if I jump back into Bubble, I'm going to head to my data types menu and open up my user data type. And if I create a new data field, I'm going to call this the name. So this is where we're going to store the name of the user. Now, whenever you create a data field in Bubble, you also have the option to select how you're going to format and structure this particular data. And in this case today, it's just going to be a plain text value because we're essentially just spelling someone's name. So I'm going to select this to be text. I'll choose to create this. Then from here, I'm going to create another field, and this is going to be called the profile photo. Now, one thing I should just point out is that you may notice as I added this data field in, when there was two separate words, instead of adding a space, I've actually added a dash. Now, I didn't just do this because my spacebar is broken, but this is actually a bit of a strategy I use to help differentiate between both my data fields and my data types. And what I mean by this is that later on, when I go to reference items from my database, if two words are separated with a dash, I know that that is a data field. Whereas if two words are separated with a space, I know that that is a data type. So it just helps avoid some confusion later on in the process. Now for this field type, I'm going to set this to be an image because a user is going to upload a photo. So I'm going to select the image option here and I'll choose to create this. And now for this profile photo, what I'd also like to do is just quickly take the time to give this a default value. So whenever someone creates an account, they might not take the time to upload a profile photo. So instead of storing no value, what I'd like to do is just store a stock user profile image. And that image is actually stored within this Google Drive that I prepared here. So today we're going to be using a series of different photos throughout our build. And instead of you having to go and source those yourself, your boy's taking care of this. And I've uploaded everything you'll need into this Google Drive, which of course, I'll be sure to include a link in the description of this video. But in this case, what you'll see is that I have a standard profile photo icon here. And this is exactly what I'm going to upload as the default profile photo that every user will have as soon as they create an account. Of course, later on, we're going to build out a feature that allows them to upload a custom profile photo, but this is just going to be the default one that they're given. So I'm just going to choose to close my Google Drive because I've already got this saved on my local device. And then I'm going to upload that now. And once I've uploaded that default image, I'm going to create one last data field, and this is going to be the account type. And for this field type, this is where I'm actually going to link this to my option set. So if I scroll on down here, you'll see that I can reference my account types option set list, which now means that someone will be able to choose from the list of 3 options I've already created. I'm going to then choose to create this, and I'm not going to give this a default value. And the reason for that is because I want users to be able to select what type of account they should have based on their role within our Uber Eats clone today. And look, that is all of my data fields I'll need to add under my user data type. It's fairly straightforward. If we jump back into Notion, I can then check these items off. And from here, we're then going to work our way down to my restaurant data type. And so when it comes to a restaurant, it's going to be pretty much the same as our user data type. We're going to store things like a name, a logo, but we're also going to store information about things like the address of the restaurant, the relevant category for the restaurant, and even a description for it. So if we jump into Bubble, we're going to open up our restaurant data type here. And the first field we're going to add in is our name of the restaurant. Now, once again, this field type is going to be text. It's super straightforward. Then for the next field, I'm going to create a logo because we're going to want to store the logo for each restaurant. And this field type, as you probably guessed, is going to be an image. I'll then create this here. Now for this image, I'm not going to upload a default value. I'm going to require each restaurant to upload a logo whenever they create their restaurant listing. Next, I'd like to create another field, and this is going to be called the featured image. So this is going to be like the banner image that's displayed at the top of a restaurant's profile page. And once again, this field type is going to be an image. I'll create that there. Then I'd like to store a field known as the address. So this is going to be the actual location where a delivery driver can pick up the goods when someone purchases something from this restaurant. And this field type is going to be a geographic address, which is then going to format this as an address that Google Maps can integrate with. So I'll choose to create this here. Then there was another field known as our categories. And this, of course, will allow a restaurant to determine what categories are relevant to the food items that they prepare. And for this field type, I'm going to link this to my option set list, which was my categories. Now, because each restaurant can be linked to more than one category. So let's say there's an Italian restaurant and they sell pizza, but you can also buy alcohol. There's not one specific category that's going to fit that particular restaurant. So what I want to do today is allow restaurants to select from multiple relevant categories. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to tick this checkbox here to make this a list of items, which essentially just means that a restaurant can now select from multiple categories. I'll then choose to create this. And finally, the very last data field is going to be our description. So this is kind of like the summary or the bio for each restaurant listing. Now this field type is super straightforward. It's just going to be text. I'll create this here. And that's everything we need to add under our restaurant data type. So we're going to jump back into Notion, tick off all of these data fields and work our way down through the list. And we're starting to make great progress here. The next thing I want to build out is our food item data type. So similar to what I mentioned before, when a restaurant creates their listing, they're going to need to obviously be able to list food items that are for sale. And for each food item, we're going to need to store some information about the name of the item, perhaps an image to show people what it looks like, as well as things like a description and a price. So I'm going to jump into Bubble, open up my food item data type, and the very first field is just going to be the name, which once again is going to be a plain text field. I'll choose to create this. Then for the next field, we were going to add an image. This field type, as you probably guessed, will also be an image. Then for each food item, there was the price of this. So how much is it going to cost? So I'm going to create another field and I'm going to call this the price. Now for this field, this should be a number. And when you select a number, we'll be able to perform some calculations on this price later on throughout our tutorial. But for the time being, I'm just going to choose to create this here. Then for each food item, I'd also like to store a description about it. So that way the restaurant owner can share some details about the food item itself. Now for this field type, of course, it's just going to be another plain text field. I'll choose to create that. And now it's at this point that we're going to create our first link between an actual data type. So if a restaurant owner was to create a food item, I obviously only want that food item to be listed on that particular restaurant page. And so what we need to do is create a link from each food item back to a specific restaurant that it should be displayed on. So what I'm going to do is create a field here and I'm going to call this the original restaurant. I'm going to abbreviate this by spelling it as OG restaurant. And for this field type, if I scroll on down, I can reference my restaurant data type, which when I create this, now means that I can link each individual food item back to a particular restaurant that it should be displayed on. And when we go on to build out the feature that allows us to actually create food item listings, I'm going to be sure to explain how we can create that link. But for the time being, that is all of the data fields we'll need to add under our food item data type. So we're going to jump back into Notion, check all of these data fields off, and then scroll on down to our checkout item. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to a checkout item, we're just going to be storing information about things like what type of item someone wants to purchase, as well as things like the quantity and the total cost. And so for our checkout item, we're going to jump into Bubble, open up the checkout item data type. And when I create a field, the first thing I'm going to store is the food item that's going to be related to this checkout. So when someone views a restaurant page and they see a food item that they want to purchase, they're going to add it to their cart. And we're essentially going to create a new item in their cart. And so for this food item, it's going to be linked, of course, to our food item data type. And this is where you'll really start to see the benefit of adding the different spacing between both our data field and our data type. So because these are both spelt the exact same, I know for a fact that my data field is spelt with a dash and my data type is spelt with a space. So I can easily differentiate between the two. Now I'm just going to choose to create this here, and then I'm going to add another field, which is going to be known as the quantity. So when someone adds a food item to their checkout, they should be able to select how many of that food item they would like to purchase. And the reason for that is, of course, if someone's either buying for lots of people or they feel like a bit of a hungry hippo, they should be able to add multiple items. So they should be able to add 5 of something, or even 9 or 10 of something. It's really up to them. But for this field type, I'm going to store this as a number. I'm going to choose to create this. The next field I'd like to add in is going to be the cost here. Now, although each food item does have its own individual price, of course, if someone is purchasing multiple quantities of the same food item, we're going to need to multiply the quantity by the food item's price. And this is going to give us the total cost of this checkout item. So for this field type, this is going to be a number, which of course will allow us to perform calculations on this later on throughout our build. I'm going to choose to create this here. Then for every checkout item, I'd also like to link this back to an original restaurant. So that way we can determine where this item is being purchased from. So I'm going to create another field here. And similar to before, I'm going to refer to this as the OG restaurant. And of course, I'm going to link this field type to my restaurant data type. I'll then choose to create this. And then finally, I'd like to add one last field, which is going to be known as the purchase status. So I'm just going to type in the word purchased. And when it comes to this field type, I'm going to set this to be a yes/no field. And the whole purpose of this data field is to determine if an item should be placed in someone's checkout, or if it's already been purchased, it should not be shown in their checkout. So by default, when someone adds an item to their checkout cart, the purchase status will be no. However, when they then go on to process their payment and actually purchase that, we're going to update the purchase status to equal yes. So that way later on, we can make sure that that item is no longer visible in their cart. So I'm going to choose to create this here. Now, as I mentioned, when it comes to the purchase status, the default value should be no, because by default, when someone adds something to their cart, they haven't yet purchased it. So what we're going to do is set the default value here to equal no. And of course, once we do process a payment, we're going to build out a workflow that will update the status in our database. And that is all of the data fields we'll need to add for our checkout item. So let's jump back into Notion, tick all of these off. And if we scroll on down, we have 2 more data types to build out. And the next one is probably one of our biggest ones. This is our order. So every single time someone places an order, there's quite a bit of information we're going to need to store. And I'm going to walk through all of these in full detail as I add them in. The first thing I'm going to want to add when I register a new order in my database is who the customer is that placed this order. So if I jump back into Bubble, I'm going to open up my order data type. I'm going to create a new field and I'm going to call this the customer. Now this field type is going to link to our existing user data type because of course a customer is a person and a person is a user in our app. I'll choose to create this. Then from here, within an order, I'd like to determine what items a user has purchased. And so I'm going to create a new field and I'm going to call this the items. And for this field type, I'd actually like this to link to our checkout item data type. Because within our checkout item, we're not only storing important information about things like the food item, but also things like the quantity. And so if we link to our checkout item, we can easily reference all of that data. Now, because someone can purchase more than one item at a time, I'm going to also tick this option to make this a list with multiple entries. So that way they can purchase multiple checkout items that have been added to their cart. And they're going to choose to create this here. And now I'm going to also add in a data field known as the total price. So this is the grand total at the end of this order. So we're going to calculate the cost of all of our checkout items and then store this within our order. So for this field type, this should just be a number. I'll then create that. Now under each order, I'd also like to reference where the restaurant is that this order has been placed. And the reason for that is of course, because later on, we're going to build out a dashboard for each restaurant. So that way they can see a list of all of their incoming orders. So I'm going to create a new field here and I'm going to call this the restaurant field. And of course, I'll be linking this field type to our restaurant data type. I'll then create this. Then when it comes to our next field, I'm going to want to reference who the delivery driver is that eventually delivers this order. So once an order is created and a restaurant actually prepares that, they're going to mark it as complete on their end. And then we're going to search for a delivery driver. And once a delivery driver accepts this order, we're going to store who that driver is within our database. So for this field type, I'm going to call this the delivery driver. And we're going to set this to be a user because of course we're going to be referencing a particular person. I'll then choose to create this here. Then on top of this, we're going to build another field known as the delivery address. And this is of course the address that our delivery driver will need to reference in order to actually deliver this particular order. So for this field type, I'm going to scroll on down and set this to be a geographic address. It's pretty straightforward. I'll then create this. And then finally, for the last few data fields, I'm going to actually use these to track the status of our order. So if I quickly just jump back into Notion, I can illustrate what I mean by this. So within our last 4 data fields here, you can see that these are all set to yes, no values. So this is just going to allow me to internalize the status of each order. So when an order is placed and then the restaurant starts to prepare that, what I'd like to do is update the status of this order to equal in progress. So the in progress status should then equal yes. Then once a restaurant has finished preparing that order, they're going to mark it as complete, and then my order is going to update to the status known as searching for a driver. So that status will then equal yes. Then of course, once a driver accepts this order, I'm going to update this status called in transit. So I'm going to set that to yes. And then once the delivery driver has finally delivered the order, I'm going to update the delivered status to equal yes. And all of these data fields are just going to help me keep track of each order in my database. So we're going to jump back into Bubble here. I'm going to create a new field, and the first status was called in progress. And of course, as I mentioned, this field type was a yes, no value, and I'm going to choose to create this. Now, by default, I'm going to set the value of this to be no, because an order once it's placed is not yet in progress. It will only be in progress once a restaurant owner starts to actually prepare that meal. So later on, we'll update the status to equal yes, but only when it's necessary. Then when it came to the next field, this was called searching for driver. And once again, this field type was a yes, no value. Once we create this, we'll also need to update the default value to be no, because by default, this meal is not yet ready to be picked up by a delivery driver. The next field was known as in transit. And as you probably guessed, the field type was of course a yes, no field. And when we create this, we'll also need to set the default value here to equal no. And then finally, there was one last field, which was the delivered field. And for this status, it was a yes, no field. And once again, the default value here should equal no. And that is all of our fields we'll need to add under our order data type. So we're going to jump back over into Notion, highlight all of these data fields and check those off. And we have one last data type to build out, and that is our review data type. So for every single review that's created, I'm going to want to store some information. So things like the actual content of the review, so that is the comment that someone adds into it, a rating for the review, and then also which restaurant the review was published for. So if we jump into Bubble, we're going to open up our review data type here. We'll create a brand new field, and this field will be called the content. So as I mentioned, this is the message that someone will add within their review. And for this field type, this is going to be a text type. We'll create that. Then we're going to create another field known as the rating. Now this rating is going to be a number. And because it's a number, it's going to allow us to perform calculations later on. So if we ever want to find the average star rating for a restaurant, this is where we can do that. I'll then choose to create this here. And then finally, the very last field is the original restaurant. So once again, the OG restaurant, this field type will of course be linked to our restaurant data type. And once we create that, that is the very last data field we'll need to build out. So I'm going to jump back into Notion, check those off, and boy oh boy, does it feel good to finish building out our database. But just when you thought we were done, I have one last thing I need to tell you. And that is if we jump back into Bubble here, under our data types, you might notice that under our user data type specifically, we have this text here that displays that there is a privacy rule applied to this by default. Now, if I click on this, it's going to take me through to my privacy menu. And essentially what this privacy rule is it's the default setting that Bubble adds to all of your user data types. And within this rule, it only allows users to see their own information that they create in your app. Now, while that can be great for things like internal tools or even project management tools, when you're building something like a food marketplace, you want everyone to be able to see the data that they create. So for instance, if a restaurant owner was to create a restaurant listing, with this privacy rule, they're the only person who would be able to view that. Whereas what you actually want is for everyone to be able to see that listing. So what we're going to do is actually head over and select this trash can icon and delete this privacy rule here. And as you'll now see, our user data type is publicly visible. Now, I assure you that is the very last thing I need to cover within this section of our tutorial today. As you can see, it took a little bit to get there, but we definitely were able to create our own custom database without having to write a single line of code. After taking the time to set up and configure our own custom database, I want to move down to the list of features that I have set out for us today. And as you can see, this list here is quite extensive. There is so much that I want to cover within this clone build. But the very first thing I want to focus on is building out the homepage of our Uber Eats clone. Now, when it comes to this page and our application in general, I'm going to break this down into as many different modules as I can, just so that way each section of this tutorial is a bit more bite-sized, because the last thing I want to do is overwhelm you with so much in the beginning of our build. And so the very first thing we're going to do is just focus on adding all of the key elements onto our homepage. And then later on, we're going to go ahead and build out things like our navigation menu, which of course will be used to power our homepage. But I'm just going to split these into two separate sections. So if we were to open up our bubble editor, I'm going to open up our index page. Now this page is the default page that comes built into any bubble application. And the index page just refers to the home page of your app. So whenever someone opens up your application, this is the page that will be displayed. So in this case, we want this to be our home page. Now, before I can go ahead and add any elements onto my page, I need to take care of a few little housekeeping things. So if I was to just double click on this page, it's going to open up our property editor. So inside of Bubble, this is where you can make changes to any of the elements that are positioned on your page. So right now you'll see that we've opened up the index page. So this is our overall page element. And the very first thing you'll need to do when you're working with any page in Bubble is head over to this layout tab and select what type of container layout you'd like this to be. Now, the container layout will just determine in which order elements will be positioned on your page. And if you were to open up this drop-down menu, you'd see 4 different options. Now, to be completely transparent, I'll only ever select between one of these 2 options down the bottom. So there's the row and there's the column. But of course, what is the difference between these 2 options? I think perhaps the best way to explain this is just by showing you a real world example. But essentially, if you were to select that your container layout should be a row, it would position elements horizontally across your page. Whereas if you were to select this to be a column, it would position elements vertically. And so what I'll do is just show you an example where I select that the container layout should be a row. Then I'm just going to add 2 button elements onto my page here. And what you'll notice is that these are stacked horizontally across my page. Whereas if I was to select on my page once again and open up the layout tab, and if I now update this to be a column, you'll see that these 2 elements are stacked vertically. Now, when it comes to most modern applications and websites, what you'll notice is that all of these products are built using a column layout. Because when you think about it, a page starts at the top and then it's built all the way down to the bottom. Now, of course, on a page, you will have sections where there's elements that are positioned horizontally across, but the overall structure of your page itself will be built from top to bottom. So in 99% of instances, I will always set the container layout of my overall page to be a column. And so this is the container layout I'm going to use on every single page of my app today. Now, while we're in our layout tab, I'm also going to update the width of our UI builder here. So right now you can see that this is set to 1080 pixels. So the preview of this page in our UI builder looks like we're creating an application for a desktop, whereas today we're actually going to be building a mobile application. So what I'm going to do is update the width of this UI builder to be 380 pixels. Now, the reason why I've selected 380 is because this is roughly the width of a mobile device, so something like an iPhone 12. But of course, throughout our tutorial today, I'm going to explain how we can make this page fully responsive, regardless of whatever device size a user is viewing our application with. So if they're viewing our product on something as small as like an iPhone 5, or something as large as a desktop, this application will be fully responsive. But for the time being, I'm just going to set the width of our UI builder to be 380 here. And after we've configured all of our layout settings, I'm just going to delete these buttons off my page because I don't need these. And it's at this point that we can start building out all of the elements I want to display on this page itself. And look, when it comes to building out this page, I'm actually going to take a bit of a strange approach. I'm going to start by building the bottom half of this page, and then I'm going to come back and build the top half. And the reason for that is because in order to make the process of building the top half simpler, we're going to need to understand a few core concepts when we build out the bottom half. And so if I was to look at the real world Uber Eats product here, what you'll see is that at the top of the page, there is a list of all of the different categories of food items that someone can purchase. And within each category, there's a little icon which someone can select. And of course, that would open up a variety of options within that category. Then below this, we have a little search bar. So this will allow someone to type in a particular category or a food item or even a restaurant that they'd like to search for. And then of course, below that, we have a long list of featured restaurants. And so today I'm just going to start by building out the search box as well as the list of restaurants, before I then come back and explain how we can build out all of the icons that are positioned at the top of our page. And so to get started, we're going to build out the search box. And to do this, we're going to scroll on down to our input forms and we're going to add in an input field here. And so an input field, as the name would suggest, allows our users to input information into this, which we can then store or use within a workflow. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to allow users to type in the name of a restaurant that they would like to search for. And then later on throughout our build, we're going to create a custom search experience that redirects someone through to a search results page and displays a long list of all of the restaurants that match a user's search query. And now before I change anything to do with this element itself, the first thing I'd like to do is update the name of this. So whenever I'm working with an input field in Bubble, I always like to update the naming conventions of this, so that way when I go to build out my workflows later on, I know exactly which input field to reference. And trust me, this is going to save you a whole lot of confusion throughout the process. So in order to change the name of an input field, we're just going to select at the top here where we see the name. I'm just going to remove the A from this and I'll call this input home search. So that way I now know this is the search field on our home page. And while I'm here, I'm also going to update the placeholder text that's displayed within this input field. So placeholder text, as the name would suggest, is just a bit of text that's placed in this input field. However, this will disappear once a user clicks in this and starts to type in a new value. And so placeholder text just prompts someone what to type into an input field. And in this case, I'd like this to display the words restaurant name ... So this is going to prompt someone to type in the restaurant that they'd like to search for. Now, while we're also in our appearance tab here, I'm just going to scroll on down to the styling of this element, and I'm going to choose to detach the style of this. And the reason for that is because I just like to update the roundness of this input field's borders. I'm going to set this to be 20, so that way it has some curved edges. And that's all I'll need to change when it comes to my styling. However, I'd now like to make this element fully responsive. So right now I can see it's only taking up a small section of my page, whereas I'd like this to be fully responsive regardless of my page size and take up as much space as it possibly can. So if I jump to my layout tab here, I'm going to head on down to my width settings for this element. Now in Bubble, when it comes to building out a fully responsive experience, there's one thing you should take away from this whole tutorial today. And that is that in order to make an element fully responsive, you need to unselect that this element should be fixed width. And if you set the minimum width to 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite, this tells Bubble that the element you're working with should have a minimum width of 0. So if the page shrinks down all the way to 0 pixels in width, this element will also shrink down to that size. However, as the page continually expands, as it has an infinite maximum width, it will continually just expand out and take up the full width of our page. Now, if I was to show you what this looks like in a real world responsive setting, I can jump over to my responsive menu here, and this is going to open up a preview of my app. And of course, you'll see the options to view this on any device size. So on a mobile device, which at the smallest possible size is 320 pixels. So things like iPhone 5s have a screen size of 320. So this is quite literally the smallest size your application will ever be. What you'll see is that this input field is fully responsive. So it fits perfectly across our page. Now, if we were to expand this out, as you'll see, because our maximum width is set to infinite, it's also going to allow this to scale up. So right now we have a fully responsive experience regardless of the device size. So once again, if you're to take away anything from this tutorial today when it comes to building a responsive app in Bubble, it's that you just need to replicate these exact same steps. So set the minimum width as 0 and we'll leave the maximum width as infinite. Now throughout our tutorial today, I am going to sound like a broken record because I'm going to use these exact same settings time and time again for every element that we build on our page. But look, I'd rather over-explain something than under-explain something and leave you with any questions. So let's just jump back into our UI builder here. I'm just going to double click on our search box and I'm just going to jump back to my layout tab because at this point in time, we've taken the time to update the width settings. Now look, when it comes to the height settings, I am quite happy to leave this as the default option. So right now this has a fixed value of 48 pixels. Now what a fixed value means is that it's always going to be the exact size that it's set to here. So the height will never be any larger or smaller than 48 pixels. And look, I'm completely fine with that. I don't need this input field to expand down or shrink. I only ever need it to be this exact size. So I'm going to keep that as the default option. Then finally, I'd also just like to add in some margins around this. So I'm going to add a top margin of 10 pixels. I won't add a bottom margin, but I'll also add a left margin of 10 and a right margin of 10. And that's just going to ensure that this input field no longer touches the borders of my page. So it just creates a much cleaner design. Now that's how we can build out our search box here. Below this, I'd like to display a list of restaurants. And when it comes to displaying a list in Bubble, you're going to need to use a special element known as a repeating group. And now repeating groups are going to become your best friend. If we scroll on down to our containers menu here, I'm going to select on the repeating group option and add this onto our page. And what you'll see is that this kind of looks something like a spreadsheet. So you can see we have all of these cells here on our page. And so it's going to display a list of things. And that is exactly what a repeating group is used for. If you ever have a list of items stored in your database and you'd like to display those to a user on your page, a repeating group is the exact element you'll need to use. And now a great real world example of a repeating group is if you were building an application like Instagram, and if you wanted to create, let's say, the feed on the homepage. So you'd have a list of images and videos. A repeating group is the element you would use. So a repeating group would fetch all of the Instagram posts from your database and display those to a user in a list. So that way they could continually scroll through it. And when you think about it, that's kind of the same experience we're going to be building out today in our Uber Eats clone here. So within our application today, what I'd like to do is display a long list of restaurants that are near the current user's location. And so we're going to be creating a feed of restaurants from our database. And now when it comes to building out a repeating group, if you are brand new to Bubble, things can get a little bit confusing because there are quite a few steps you need to follow in order to bring this feature to life. And the very first thing you need to do with a repeating group is head over to your Appearance tab, and you'll see here we have this option to give this a data source. And that's because if Bubble's displaying a list of items from your database, it needs to know which items to actually display. And so for the type of content, I'd like to display a long list of restaurants. So I'm going to select from my restaurant data type. Then from here, we'll need to give this a data source. So once again, Bubble knows which particular restaurants to show to any given user. And this is where you can create what's known as a dynamic experience. So when you create a data source, you can customize this to each individual user. So for instance, going back to my Instagram clone experience, if we were going to display a list of Instagram posts where the post was published by someone that a user follows, obviously everyone's going to follow different users in our application, so everyone would have a different feed. And so in that instance, no two user accounts would look the same. And this is really what I love about Bubble. It truly is one of the most powerful no-code tools there is, as you can create fully custom experiences for all of your users. So for our data source today, what I'm going to do is perform a search in my database for all of the restaurants. And when it comes to these restaurants, I'm only going to want to display those that are within a certain distance from the current user's location. And so let's say if a user logs in, I might want to only show them a list of restaurants that are within a 10-kilometer radius of them. And so what I can do is reference the address field under our restaurant data type. And I'm only going to display restaurants where the address is within, and then I'm just going to type in 10 kilometers. Now, of course, you can customize this to whatever radius you would like. But for me, I'm just going to type in the number 10 here. I'm then going to select to reference kilometers. Of course, if you're based in the United States, you could use something like miles. But for me, I'm just going to use metric. So I'm going to select kilometers. And I want to display restaurants that are within 10 kilometers of the current user's position. So if I just scroll on down, what you'll actually see is this option to reference the current geographic position of the user. And so that's going to pull their current location. And now we'll be displaying a list of restaurants in a close proximity to that user. Now, I'm also going to choose to sort these restaurants in a random order. So I'm going to select the random sorting option. And what that's going to do is just give an even amount of distribution to every restaurant. So that way we're not going to be playing favorites by allocating a certain restaurant at the top. These will just rotate evenly. Now that's all we'll need to configure for our data source here. So I'm going to choose to close this. Now the next thing we'll need to configure when it comes to our repeating group is the number of rows and columns we're going to display. So right now these options are fixed at 4 rows and 1 column, which just means that it's only going to display 4 restaurants and there'll be 1 restaurant per every line. Now that's not the experience I want to create today. I don't just want to display 4 restaurants, I want to display, let's say, an infinite amount of restaurants that are within 10 kilometers of the user's current location. And so what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows. And what you'll now see is that this will just change this to now just have a minimum height of each row. Now I will come back and change this in a moment, but this isn't important right now. What I would like to do, however, is just keep the number of columns fixed as 1, because I do still only want 1 restaurant to be displayed per line item here. So I'm not going to make any changes to this. I'll then just quickly jump over to my layout tab. And just when you thought we were getting the hang of things, I'm going to throw in even more settings that we need to change. And this is why I mentioned before that repeating groups are pretty complex if you are brand new to Bubble. But of course, I'm going to be sure to explain everything in as much detail as I can here. So inside of a repeating group, we have all of these different cells. Now, each of these cells is kind of like a small page of its own, which means that if we have the ability to edit a page, we're going to have the ability to update its container layout. And of course, the container layout is which order we're going to position elements on our page. So do we want to position elements in our repeating group horizontally or vertically? And in this case, I'd like to stack elements in our repeating group vertically, so from top to bottom. So that means that I'm going to need to once again select the container layout as a column. Then from here, we'll jump down to our width settings and we're going to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like before, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So now this repeating group is going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. So it is now fully responsive. Now I will come back and update the height and the margin settings in a moment. But before we do that, we're going to need to add in all of the elements inside of our repeating group that we want to display. And so if we were going to replicate the real world Uber Eats experience, the first thing I'd like to display for each restaurant is the featured image of that. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to grab an image element here and I'll add this into my repeating group cell. Now, what I love about repeating groups is let's say there's going to be a list of 10 restaurants being displayed to any user. Instead of having to build out an image for every single restaurant, all you'll need to do is design the very first cell of your repeating group and Bubble will automatically replicate that across every other cell. So you only need to design it once and it will be displayed as many times as it's needed. And so when it comes to this image, we're going to insert dynamic data, which means we're going to pull data from our database. And I'm going to reference the current cell's restaurant. And what Bubble just means by the current cell's restaurant is, let's say once again, we're displaying a list of 10 restaurants. In cell number 1 of our repeating group, we're going to display the very first restaurant. In cell number 2, we'll display the second restaurant. In cell number 3, it'll be the third restaurant, and so on. And so this image is just going to pull the information from each restaurant based on which cell it's in. And so for the restaurant in cell number 1, it's going to pull that restaurant's particular information, and the list will just go on based on how many restaurants you want to show. And so I'm going to reference the current cell's restaurant, its featured image here. Now, just a personal preference of mine, and by all means, this isn't completely necessary, is that when I'm working with dynamic images, I also like to select this More option, and I like to just process my images with ImgX, just so that way I can select this option to resize and fit the dimensions of this image by cropping it. And what that just means is that if the image is not this exact size, Bubble will automatically expand it out and crop it, so that way it fits perfectly into whatever dimensions I give this image. And so that's just going to create a much cleaner end user experience. From here though, we're just going to scroll on down in our appearance tab, and I'm just going to detach the default style of this image. And the reason for that is because while I'm working with this image, I'm just going to give it a solid border color. So that way, if I was to click away from this image, I can now see where it sits within my repeating group. Now, by all means, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can remove this border. But just for the time being, when we're actually constructing our application, I want to be able to easily see where all of my elements fit on the page. While we're here working on our borders, I'm also going to update the roundness of this picture's border to be 5, so that way it has some slightly curved edges. And then from here, we can jump over to our layout tab and make this element fully responsive. So like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So that way this image is now going to take up as little or as much space as it can on our page. But what I'd also like to do is update the height settings for this image. I want this image to be more of a rectangle. So what I'm actually going to do is select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to set this aspect ratio to be 2:1. So that way the length is going to be twice as long as the height. And now you'll see we have this nice rectangle. Then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And that will just ensure that this image doesn't touch the borders of my repeating group that it sits within. And just like that, we've finished adding in the very first element into our repeating group. Below this, I'd like to display the actual name of the restaurant itself. So if I just head up to my visual elements, I'm going to grab another text element. I'll add this into my repeating group cell, and I'm just going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to once again reference the current cell's restaurant. Only in this case, the data field I'd like to display is going to be the name. And that's all we'll need to select here. I would just like to scroll on down to the styling of this text element and just attach the default style, because I just like to update the font size here to be 16, so that way it's slightly larger. And then from here, of course, we'll need to make this element fully responsive. So if we jump to our layout tab, the first thing I'm actually going to do is position this element in the next position inside of our repeating group, so that way it actually sits below our image. I'll then make this text element fully responsive. So I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. I'll leave the maximum width as infinite. And of course, that means that this text element is going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. When it comes to the height of this text element, and look, when I work with any text element, I do like to update the minimum height to also be 0. And what you'll now see is that it's going to collapse and fit perfectly around all of the text inside of it. So that way we don't have any unnecessary height. But of course, what I will do is leave the maximum height as infinite. So that way, if a restaurant has a really long name, this text element will expand down and allow us to display all of that text inside of it. But that's all I'll need to change for my height settings as well. Finally, I just like to add in the same margins that we've done on our image around our text element. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. I won't add any on the bottom, but I'll add 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And now within our repeating group, there is one very last element I'd like to display, and that is going to be the average star rating for each restaurant. So that way, when someone's viewing a list of restaurants on their homepage, they can get a good idea as to what the general consensus of this restaurant is. Now, unfortunately, Bubble doesn't have a default element that allows us to display a star rating. However, there's no need to stress because there is a free plugin built by Bubble, which allows us to actually do that quite easily. So if we just head to our plugins tab here, we're going to open up our plugins library, and we're just going to type in the word star, and we're going to install this plugin built by Bubble, which is the Bootstrap Star Rating Input. I'll choose to install this. I can then close my plugin library and jump back to my design tab. And if we were to scroll on down to our input forms, I'm just going to move my head out of the way here. What you'll see is that we now have this star rating input field. So this actually allows users to add a star rating when they're leaving things like reviews, which we are going to build out today within our Uber Eats clone. However, what we can also do is display a star rating. So I'm going to grab our star rating input field here, and I'm going to add this into my repeating group. I'll just move my head back to the other side of the page. Now, when it comes to this star rating, I'm going to make a few minor tweaks. And the very first thing I'd like to do is update the star size to be XXS. So it's just going to be slightly smaller there. I'm also going to select this option here to disable this input field. And the reason for that is because within this section of our homepage, I don't want users to actually leave a star rating. Instead, I only want to display an existing star rating. And so although this element is an input field, I'm going to treat it like a visual element that displays information. And the way in which I can display the average star rating for this restaurant's reviews is within this initial content field. Now, if you're not familiar with initial content in Bubble, it's kind of like the placeholder text that I'd mentioned before, only it's a permanent value. And so if I was to just perhaps select on the input field at the top of my page, you'll see that within our appearance tab, there's two different input fields. There's our placeholder text, which, as I explained, is a value that's displayed until a user clicks in this input field, and then that value will disappear and it will display whatever a user types in. But there's also a field known as the initial content. Now, initial content acts like placeholder text, so whatever you add here will be displayed within this field. However, when a user clicks in this field, the initial content will not disappear. It is a value that a user can actually change. So it's a permanent value. And in this case today, I'm going to reference the initial content and calculate the average star rating for all of the reviews that have been submitted for this restaurant. And before I show you how we can build out that calculation, I'd just like to quickly summarize once again how we've structured the reviews in our database. So if I head to my data tab here and open up my data types, I'm going to select my review data type. Now for every review that is submitted, there's two particular data fields I'd just like to point out. There is of course our original restaurant field. So every review is linked to a unique restaurant. And then within each review, it's given a rating, which is a number. Now the beauty of working with numbers in Bubble is that you can perform calculations. And so what I'd like to do is over in my design tab for our star rating here, I'd like to perform a search in my database for all of the reviews that belong to each individual restaurant. And I'd just like to calculate the average star rating that they have received. So for our initial content here, I'm going to perform a search for all of the reviews where the original restaurant that review was published for equals the same value as the current sales restaurant. Then from here, once I've identified all of the reviews for this particular restaurant, I'm going to reference each review's rating. So if I select the each item's rating, and then if I scroll on down, I can reference the average of those ratings. So Bubble's going to calculate all of those ratings and find the average based on what users have input. And if I was to click away, you'll see that will validate, and we are now displaying the average star rating. Now from here, I'm just going to jump into my layout tab and move this to the last position within my repeating group. I'm also just going to update the height here. Unfortunately, when we're working with this input field, it doesn't have all of the minimum and maximum settings. We just have these fixed values, but I am just going to set the height to be 30 pixels, so that way it fits nicely around the actual stars inside of this. But then finally, I'm also going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. I will add 10 pixels of margin at the bottom because this is the very last element I'd like to add into my repeating group. And then of course, I'll also add in 10 on the left and 10 on the right. Now, as I mentioned, that is everything I'd like to display within my repeating group. And to be honest, I'm actually going to contradict myself, and I'm just going to actually remove some of this height between my star element and my restaurant name. I'm just going to set the top margin to be 5 instead of 10. Just so it's slightly more condensed there. But of course, this is just a personal preference. You don't need to change that if you don't want. But because I finished adding all of my elements into my repeating group, you may remember that I mentioned I was going to come back and update the height settings in a moment for my repeating group. And it's at this point in time, I'd like to do that now. So I'm going to select on my overall repeating group here, and I'm going to jump to my layout tab. Now, what I'm going to do is update the minimum height of our repeating group to be 0. Which means it's going to collapse around all of the text inside of this. Now, with our repeating group, at this point in time, you're only going to see one repeating group cell. You no longer see a long list of items. However, I do just want to assure you that it is going to display a long list of restaurants. So if Bubble needs to display 5 restaurants, it will display 5 restaurants. If it needs to display 50, it will display 50. So this repeating group is going to display as many or as little restaurants as is required. The last thing I'd like to do while we're in our layout tab here is just update the top margin to be 10 pixels. And I'm not going to add any additional margin here. I purely just wanted to add that so I could separate the repeating group from the input field above it there. And now this concludes the bottom half of our homepage that I'd like to create. And it's at this point that I'd now like to build out the top section of our page, which is where we're going to display a list of all of the categories and the icon associated with that category. So that way, if a user ever just wants to view a list of restaurants based on a particular category, they can click on that and they'll be redirected through to a search results page where they'll see a long list of relevant results. Now, the reason why I saved the top section of this page till last is because it's slightly more complex again. Now, because we're displaying a list of categories, we're going to actually build out another repeating group. But one thing you'll notice on the Uber homepage is that this repeating group is not displayed vertically down our page. Instead, it's displayed horizontally across the page. And of course, the categories that we're going to display are the categories within our option set list within our database. So once again, I'm just going to quickly divert and open up my data tab. And if we head to our option sets here, you might remember that we had created a list, and within that, I just added a few short items. So there's categories like alcohol, seafood, pizza, burgers, and so on. And so I'll want to display all of these categories horizontally across the top of my page. So in order to do that, we're going to jump into our design tab and we're going to need to add yet another repeating group at the top of our page here. So I'm going to add this in. Now, similar to before, the very first thing you'll need to do with a repeating group is update the type of content. So that way Bubble knows exactly what type of data it should display. Now, in this case, we're going to reference our categories. So this is our option set list. And then for the data source, this is nice and straightforward. We're just going to display all of the categories from that list. And now this is where things are going to get slightly more complex. When we'd previously built out our existing repeating group, this is what was known as a vertically scrolling repeating group. So of course, as I'd mentioned, we're displaying a feed of restaurants that is going to be displayed from top to bottom on our page. Whereas what we'll need to create at the top here is a horizontally scrolling repeating group, which allows us to scroll side to side. So if we've got a long list of categories, we need to be able to swipe through those. And so in order to create that experience, what we're going to need to do is unselect that this repeating group should not be a fixed number of rows. And I'd like to unselect that this should also be a fixed number of columns. Now, once we've unselected both of these values, you'll see the option to update the scroll direction of our repeating group to not be vertical, but instead be horizontal. So now this repeating group will scroll side to side. Now, I personally just find that when it comes to working with horizontal repeating groups, these are a little bit more complex to configure. And as you'll probably see in our example today, in order to build the perfect horizontal repeating group, it just takes a whole lot of tinkering. So please don't stress if you don't get things perfectly right the first time around. As you'll probably see in a moment, I'm going to make quite a few mistakes, but we'll eventually figure out the perfect dimensions and settings for this repeating group as we tinker around with all of the configurations. And now the first thing I'd like to change when it comes to the dimensions of this repeating group is within my layout tab. I'm going to start by updating the container layout of this repeating group to be a column. And the reason for that is because inside of each repeating group cell, I'm going to display two elements. At the top of our repeating group, there's first of all going to be a little icon for that category. And then below that, I'm going to display some text that shows the actual name of that category. And so because I'm displaying these two elements on top of each other, I'm going to need to set the container layout for our repeating group to be a column. Then if we scroll on down to our width settings, I'm going to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Now, of course, this is nothing new. As I explained, we want this repeating group to shrink down to the smallest possible size, but also expand to the largest possible size. So that's why I'm adding these settings in. For the height though, we are going to come back and update this in a moment. But before I change any of these settings, I'd like to now build out all of the elements that are going to sit inside of our repeating group. And the very first thing I want to do is add the relevant icon inside of our repeating group for each category. So if I scroll on up, I'm going to head to my visual elements and I'm going to grab an image element. Now I'm going to add this into our repeating group cell. And when it comes to this image, if I was to insert dynamic data, you can see that we have the option to reference the current cell's category. But within this category, we haven't actually stored an icon for each option. And so what I'd actually like to do is digress and explain how we can add that in. So if I just quickly jump back into my data tab once again, and I'm sure you're probably sick of me jumping between these two tabs, but up to this point, when we created our list of option sets for our categories here, we just added in the name of each category. But wouldn't it be great if we could also store an icon for each category, so that way we could easily reference it within our repeating group? Well, thankfully, your boy is one step ahead, and that is exactly what we're going to do here. When it comes to building option sets, you have the ability to create what's called an attribute. And what you'll see is that each option within our list already has an existing attribute, which is the display text. So this text is the actual name of the option itself. So alcohol, seafood, pizza, and so on. And the best thing about these attributes is that they kind of act like data fields where you can store existing information in them. So let's say if I wanted to create another attribute here, what I could do is say that for every category option set, I'd like to store an icon, and this attribute type should be an image. So this is a very familiar process to creating a data field under a data type. And now if I was to select to modify the attributes of any of these options, you'll see I have the ability to not only update the display text, but I can now upload a custom icon. And when it comes to these icons, I've already prepared a list that you can actually upload yourself. So over in a Google Drive folder here, which of course I'll be sure to include a link to this in the description of this video, you'll see that I've taken the time to upload a series of small icons. So if I just open this up here, you can see that this is the icon for alcohol, We then have the icon for Thai and then burgers as well. And so what you can do is actually just download all of these icons because these are the exact icons I'll be using in my option set list today. And so I'm just going to take the time to now upload these into that list. So for my alcohol category, I'm going to choose to upload an icon. And once I've uploaded that, I'm going to choose to now save this. I'll then do the same thing for seafood. So I'll modify this attribute. I'll choose to upload the custom icon. Once that's uploaded, I'll then choose to save this. I'll do the same thing for pizza. I'll upload this icon. I can then choose to save that. And look, I won't bore you as I upload the rest of these icons, but what I'd recommend doing is just pausing the tutorial here and just take the time to upload the remaining icons because that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to quickly pause this video here and take a minute to upload these on my end. And then from here, we can continue on displaying these on our homepage. Alright, so once I've taken the time to upload all of my custom icons, I'm then going to jump back to my design tab here. And when it comes to the dynamic image data source here within my repeating group, I'm going to now be able to reference the current sales category, its icon image. Now, similar to our previous image within our existing repeating group, I'm also going to select this more option and choose to process this image with ImgX, just so I can select to resize and fit the dimensions of this image by cropping it. I'll then choose to close that. I'm also then just going to scroll on down to the style of this image and detach the default style because I'd like to update the border around this image to be a solid border. Now, of course, once again, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can remove this border, but just while we're actually building our app inside of our bubble editor, this is going to allow us to easily see where this image sits. From here, we'll then need to update the dimensions of this image. So if we jump to our layout tab, what I'm going to do is update the width of this image to be 50 pixels. Now, I am going to keep this as a fixed value. I'm not going to make this fully responsive. And the reason for that is because I'm always going to want this image to just be 50 pixels in width. No smaller and no larger. So I actually don't want this element to be responsive in that sense. I'd also like to select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to leave this as a 1:1 ratio, which now means that this image is 50 pixels by 50 pixels. I can also choose to horizontally align this image in the center of my repeating group cell. And then finally, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And that's how I can display my icon element. Below this though, I'd like to display the actual name of this category. So under my visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element. I'll add this in and I will insert dynamic data and reference the current sales category, its display text. So that is the name of the category itself. Now for this text, I am going to scroll on down to my styling here and detach the default style once again. And the reason for that is because I'd first of all like to center align this text in the middle of the element. I'd also like to update the font weight here to be 600, so that way it's semi-bold. I'll then jump over to my layout tab. And what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width here to be 0. However, unlike our existing text element, I'm not going to leave the maximum width as infinite. Instead, I'm going to set this to be 150 pixels, which just means that at the smallest possible size, this element will be fully responsive. So it will collapse down to 0. However, as the page expands out, the maximum width of this text element will be no larger than 150 pixels. And the reason I'm doing this is because if I had this set as an infinite maximum width, our text element would expand all the way out and it would just look strange because our image actually wouldn't follow along because it's not fully responsive. So what I'm going to do is set a maximum width at 150 pixels. So what you see right here is the longest this text element will ever be. So it's 150 pixels. And that lines up quite nicely with the image element that sits above it. It just looks like a good ratio between these two. For the height though, I will set the minimum height to be 0 and I will leave the maximum height to be infinite. So that way, if a category's name is quite long, it will just push that down to a new line and expand our text element vertically. And then finally, I'm just going to add 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this text element. And now that is everything we'll need to add into our repeating group. But as you can see, at this point in time, our repeating group doesn't look like the experience we want to create. As I mentioned, I don't want this to be a vertical looking repeating group. I want this repeating group to display and scale horizontally across my page. So if I select on the repeating group itself and jump to my layout tab, what I'm going to do is head on down to my minimum height here. And unlike our existing repeating group where we set the minimum height to be 0, when you're working with a horizontal scrolling repeating group, what you'll need is the height to be the exact height of all of the elements inside of the repeating group. And this is where sometimes you'll need to just play around and tinker with a few different settings. And because this repeating group will never scroll or expand vertically down our page, the height for this doesn't need to be responsive. It can be a fixed value. So what I'm going to do is select that this height should be a fixed value, and then I can just tinker around. So I can see that with 350 pixels of fixed height, I'm displaying 3 different rows. So what I could do is, let's say, make this 200 pixels, and I can see I've still got all of this empty space here. So I might make it 150 pixels. And look, even then, I've still got quite a bit of empty space. But if I set this to, let's say, 120 pixels, that looks perfect. So with my 10 pixels of margin under my text here, it's going to be displayed quite nicely on my page. Now, look, there are more scientific ways to do this. You could calculate, for instance, the exact height of your image here. And if you were to, let's say, have a fixed height for your text element, you could calculate that height. And then that could give you the exact height you need here for your repeating group. As I mentioned at the start of building out this repeating group, if you're brand new to Bubble, the process of creating a horizontal scrolling repeating group can be a bit overwhelming. It's very different to creating a vertical scrolling repeating group. And don't worry, we're not going to use too many horizontal repeating groups within our application today. So this was by far the most complex one we're going to need to create. Now look, at this point in time, that's everything I want to build out on my homepage. You can see it's starting to slowly come together here. Now, if I was to take a preview of this page, what you'll see over in my editor is that at the very top of our page, we have our repeating group displaying our list of categories. Now, if I was to just reduce the width of my browser here, you'll see that I can scroll horizontally across all of these categories. So this repeating group looks great. I'm quite happy with how it's turned out. We then also have our search field here, but of course, at this point in time, I haven't explained how we can create a new restaurant in our database. So our repeating group that's displaying restaurants will not have anything to display. And that's just because we don't have any data in our database for Bubble to show. But at this point in time, I just want to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out all of the main elements on our homepage. Now, of course, as I mentioned at the start of this module, I wanted to break the homepage down into a couple of different modules because at this point, I'm sure you're probably already overwhelmed with how much I just covered. And look, please don't stress, the homepage is probably one of the more difficult pages to create, particularly if this is the very first app you're building in Bubble. But look, at this point in time, I'm quite happy with the progress we've made so far. Working our way down the list of features within my Notion checklist, the next thing I wanted to cover is how we can actually finish up building out our homepage by creating a navigation menu. So within our Uber Eats application today, we're actually going to create 2 separate navigation menus. There's going to be our header navigation menu, which will be displayed at the top of our page. Now that's going to display things like the Uber Eats logo, as well as a user's checkout. And then at the footer of our page, we're going to create a navigation menu, which allows users to navigate between all of the different pages we're going to create within our app today. Now, thankfully, in comparison to actually building out the homepage itself, this section of our tutorial is going to be fairly straightforward. Of course, there is going to be a few little specific things that I need to point out, but it's nothing that we can't handle inside of Bubble. So let's just open up our Bubble editor, and over on our homepage here, this is where we want to add both of our navigation menus. Now, when it comes to a navigation menu, we're going to display a series of elements horizontally across our page. Now, if you ever wanted to have a section of your page displayed horizontally, what you'd actually need to do is add what's known as a group element onto your page. So if you remember, if I was to select on our overall page here, so this is our index, the container layout of this page is currently set to be a column. And the reason for that is because we're stacking all of the elements from top to bottom. But what happens if we want a section of our page with elements displayed horizontally? As I mentioned, what you can do is scroll on down to the containers menu here and add what's known as a group element onto your page. Now, a group is just like a small page within your overall page. And of course, because it's like a page, that means you have the ability to give it a container layout. And so for instance, you could give a container layout to this group and set it as a row, which now means that any elements you add into this section of your page, so within this group, they're going to be displayed horizontally. And perhaps as an example, I could just add in a couple of different buttons here, so that way you can see how this is going to work. Now, these have been stacked on top of each other just because this group doesn't have enough space to add both of those buttons in. But if I was to, let's say, set the maximum width of this to be infinite, you'll now see that these will be positioned side by side. And the reason why I'm pointing all of this out is because when it comes to our navigation menus today, this is exactly how we're going to build out the whole experience. because of course I want to display all of my elements horizontally. However, I'm not just going to build these out on the page itself. Instead, what I'm going to do is create what's known as a reusable element inside of Bubble. Now, if you are brand new to Bubble, I don't expect you to know what a reusable element is. But as you might have guessed, the name suggests that it's an element that you can reuse throughout multiple places in your application. And this is actually perfect for things like navigation menus, because when you think about it, every page is going to leverage the same navigation menu. So instead of having to rebuild it on every single page from scratch, what you could do is create it once as a reusable element, and then you can easily just reference and display it wherever you would like. So it just saves you from having to do a whole bunch of extra work. Now, in order to create a reusable element, you'll need to open up your page drop-down menu, and right at the bottom here, you're going to see this option to add a new reusable element. So we're going to select on this. I'm then going to call our reusable element my header menu. I'll choose to create this. Then what's going to happen is Bubble's going to send you through to almost like a separate page inside of your app. And this is where we can create the reusable element. So whatever we build here, we're going to later add to our actual index page. And if I was to double click on this reusable element and just head over to my appearance tab, you can see that this reusable element is set to be a group. Now you can create groups, pop-ups, or floating groups, but I'm not going to confuse you with all of these options because today we're only going to be using a group. Now, because we are working with a group, we're going to have the ability to give this a container layout. So if we jump to our layout tab, we'll set the container layout to be a row because as I previously mentioned, I'd like to stack elements side by side within this group. While we're in our layout tab, I'm also then going to update the width in our UI builder. I'm going to set this to be 380 pixels. And the reason why I've selected 380 is of course because that's the same width as the home page within our UI builder. But of course this element, as you'll see, is currently fully responsive. So the minimum width is set to 0 and the maximum width is set to infinite. So if I just open up my responsive tab here, you'll see that this group will either scale or contract based on the size of a user's browser. So by default, it is going to be fully responsive. Now inside of our header menu, I'm going to add two separate sections. In the top left-hand corner, I'd like to add an Uber Eats logo. And then in the top right-hand corner, I'd like to display a checkout icon. And beside that icon, I just want to show a user how many items are currently in their cart. And so when it comes to our image element first, I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll grab an image. I'll add this into my group. And I'm actually going to upload a static image. Now I'm going to be uploading this from my local device, but of course, if you still have access to the Google Drive folder I've mentioned before, you'll see inside of that, I've uploaded the same Uber Eats logo that I'm about to use. So I'd recommend downloading that and then also uploading it as a static image here. Once that's uploaded though, I'm just going to jump over to my layout tab and I will update the width of this image. I'm going to set this to be 150 pixels and I would like to keep this as a fixed width. I don't want this image to scale out or shrink based on the size of my page. I'm always going to want it to be 150 pixels in width. I'm also going to select to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And what you'll then see is that Bubble's automatically going to detect the existing aspect ratio for this image. And so I'm quite happy to leave it as is. Then from here, I'm also going to vertically align this image in the center of my group. And I'll just add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this image. So that way, when I collapse the group in a moment around it, it's not going to touch the borders of the group itself. Now, on the other side of my group here, I'd like to display, as I mentioned, a little shopping cart icon. And next to that, I'm going to display a count of how many items are within a user's cart. But when it comes to the design of this, if I was to just jump into a separate bubble editor here, what you'll see is that I've added the icon and the actual number inside of this black group here. And that just creates a much nicer user experience. And so that's something we're going to replicate within our own build today. And so if I just jump back into my existing bubble editor, what we're going to do is actually add yet another group inside of our existing group. And you'll find that this is a very common thing you do in Bubble. When it comes to building pages, you're going to find that you'll be stacking a lot of group elements into each other. So if I scroll on down to my containers menu, I'm going to add a group element. And when it comes to this group, I'm actually going to take the time to update the name of this. I'm going to call this group checkout. And the reason for that is because later on throughout our tutorial today, when someone clicks on this checkout, I'd like to actually do something in a workflow. And so if I just give this group a name, it's just going to allow me to easily distinguish between which group I want to reference. Now for the container layout of this group, it's also going to be a row because as you saw, I'm going to stack an icon element next to a text element. I'm then also just going to quickly update the width of this. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And look, I will come back and update the width and the height in a moment. But for the time being, I just want to quickly jump to my appearance tab here because I'd like to detach the style of this group and give this a flat background color. And that color is of course going to be black. I'll also then update the roundness of this group's borders to be 100. So that way it has curved edges. And then finally, I can add my icon element as well as my text element inside of this group. So if I head to my visual elements, I'm going to start by grabbing an icon. I'll add this into my black group and I'm just going to type in the word cart and I'm going to reference this little shopping cart here. I'll update the color of this to be white and then I'll jump to my layout tab because I just like to vertically align this icon in the center of my black group and then finally add some margins around this. I should also point out that when it comes to the height and width, I'm quite happy to leave this as the default settings, which is 30 pixels by 30 pixels, and they're both fixed values. So what that means is that this icon will always be this size. Now for the margins, I'm going to set the top margin to be 5 pixels, the bottom margin to be 5 pixels, the left and right margins, however, I'm going to set to be 10 pixels. So that's just going to push this icon in slightly further there. And that's everything I'll need to change for this element. Beside this, I'm then going to display a text element, which will show the total number of items a user has added to their checkout cart. So if I head to my visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element and add this into my black group. Now, when it comes to the text I'd like to display, I'm actually going to need to perform a bit of a calculation here. And so if I want to display a total count of how many checkout items someone has added to their cart, I should quickly just summarize once again how we've structured our database around this feature. So within our data tab, under our data types here, we have what's known as a checkout item. So every single time a user adds something to their cart, I'm going to create a checkout item. And within that, it's going to include some information about things like the food item, the quantity of how many items they've added, as well as if they've actually gone on to purchase that item or not. And of course, there's a bunch of different data in there, but I just want to highlight that a checkout item is going to be created each time someone adds an item to their cart. Now, if I jump into my design tab, what I'm going to do is choose to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to perform a search in my database. And within this search, I'm going to find all of the checkout items where, first of all, the person that created this checkout item is the current user. So every single time a checkout item or anything is created in your database, Bubble will automatically link the user who created that item. And so I can reference the created by field when that equals the current user. So the current user is the person logged into their Uber Eats account. And so this is the person who has added a checkout item to their own cart. Now, I'd also like to only display the checkout items that have not yet been purchased. So if an item has gone on to be purchased, I don't want it to display in a user's cart because they no longer need to buy that item, they've already bought it. So I'm just going to add yet another constraint and I'm going to only count the checkout items where the purchase field equals no, which it will be by default whenever a checkout item is created. Then from here, I'm going to perform a count of how many checkout items meet this search. And that is how we can reference a number. Now, because this text sits within a black group, I'm just going to need to change the style of this. So I'm going to detach the style here. I'll update the text color to be white. While I'm here, I'll also update the font size to be 16, and I will align this text in the center of the element. I can then also scroll on up, and one thing I should point out is that when you work in Bubble, a recent feature they've launched is the ability to add what's known as a canvas placeholder. So this is kind of similar to the placeholder text you'll see within an input field, but essentially what it means is that while you're building your application inside the Bubble editor, so this is also known as the Bubble canvas, this placeholder text will just allow you to temporarily show a value. So if I was to, let's say, set the canvas placeholder to be 0, this will just display the number 0. And the reason why I've selected 0 is because by default, a user would not have any items in their checkout cart. Now, by all means, I should just point out that because this is a placeholder in my canvas, it's only going to display the number 0 while I'm actually editing my application. If I was to go and preview my app, it would revert back to this search here and display the total count. But just while you're working inside a Bubble, instead of displaying this long text query here, it's just going to display this short number 0, because that will match the real world experience that our end users see. Now, while we're here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I'm going to need to make this element fully responsive. So as you probably guessed, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. However, as you can see, right now, this little text element is going to take up as much space as it can because the maximum width is set to infinite. Whereas I actually only want it to take up the space that it needs to display the relevant number. So what we actually can do is select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And now that's going to wrap perfectly around whatever number is displayed. And it's only going to allocate the amount of width to display the exact number we need. I'm then going to do the same thing for our height. So if I set the minimum height to be 0, it's going to collapse nicely around the text there. I'll vertically align this in the center of my black group. And now finally, I can add in some margins around this text element. I'm going to add in 5 pixels of margin at the top, 5 on the bottom. I won't add any on the left just because the margin is actually on my icon beside it. But I will just add in 10 pixels of margin on the right. So that way, in a moment, when I close this black group, it's not going to touch this text element. And so that is all of the elements I need to add inside this black group. So we can now select on this group, open up our layout tab. And when it comes to the minimum height, I'm going to set this to be 0. And that's automatically going to collapse nicely around all of the elements. But I'm going to want to do the exact same thing for our width. Because at this point in time, I can see we have all of this empty space here. And the reason for that is because the maximum width is once again set to be infinite. So what I could do is select that I want to fit the width of this element to all of the content inside of it. And as you'll see, it's just going to collapse perfectly around that. And that is how we can create this nice user experience that looks almost like a small button. But finally, I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of my group. And I'll just need to add in some margins around the black group itself. And for these margins, I'm just going to set all of the values here to be 10. And because this is the very last element I'd like to add into my white group, I'm going to select on the overall group. So this is our header menu. And I can now update the minimum height here to be 0, which means it's going to collapse around all of these elements quite nicely. But of course, right now, as you can probably see, all of our elements inside of this header menu aren't really positioned where we want them. What I'd like is to display this Uber Eats logo on the left-hand side, which it currently is. That looks great. But I'd actually like this second group, so my black group here, to be positioned over to the right. Whereas currently right now, it's positioned over to the left here. And the way we can fix that is by updating what's known as the container alignment. So when you set your container layout to be a row, you'll have this option here to update the position of all of the elements that sit inside of this group. And right now you'll see everything is aligned to the left. So it's been pushed over to this side. If I was to, let's say, put these in the center, you'll see everything will be positioned in the center. But what I'm interested in selecting today is this option here, which is known as space between. And what that means, as the name would suggest, is that it's going to push both of our elements out to the side, and it's going to add an even amount of space between these two elements, regardless of the page's size. So if I just jump over to my responsive tab, and if I view this page at 320 pixels, so this is the smallest possible mobile size, what you'll see is that both of these elements are pushed to the side of our group. But if I was to expand my page out, you'll see that they will still have an even amount of space between them. So this is how we can once again create a truly responsive experience across any device size. And this actually concludes everything I wanted to add within our header menu here. So what I'd now like to do is add this onto our main homepage. So if we open up our page dropdown, select our index page, which is our home page we'd previously built. What I'd now like to do is add that header menu to the top of our page. And in order to do that, I'm just going to need to move my head out of the way here. And if you scroll right down to the bottom of your elements tree, you'll see here you have the ability to reference your reusable elements. And within that, of course, we have the header menu that we've just created. And this is where you'll really start to see the power of reusable elements come to life. As I mentioned, with a reusable element, you only have to build it once and you can reference it anywhere throughout your application. So if I wanted, I could add this to the top of my page here. And what you'll see is that it's automatically going to add everything we've built into this group directly onto our page. One thing I should just point out when it comes to a reusable element though, is that if you ever want to make changes to this element, you're going to need to do that within the separate editor that we've just built this in. You can't make changes directly on this page here. But thankfully, the process of adding this onto any page in the future is going to be as simple as just dragging and dropping it wherever we want to display it. And look, that is how we can create a header menu. But what I'd now like to do is create a reusable footer menu. So I want a menu that's always going to be positioned at the bottom of our page. And within that footer menu, we're going to allow users to navigate between all of the different pages within our app. So in order to create that menu, I'm going to once again build another reusable element. So I'm going to choose to add a new reusable element, and I'm going to call this the footer menu. I'll choose to create this. Now, when it comes to this footer menu, the process of building this out is going to be much the same as creating our header menu. In fact, I think it's actually going to be much simpler. But one thing I should just highlight is that if I double click on this page and head over to my appearance tab, instead of using a group element, we're going to use what's known as a floating group. And the reason for this is because in Bubble, a floating group and a normal group are two separate things. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is just by quickly jumping back over to my homepage. I do apologize for jumping between my pages, but I just want to show you a real world example. So if I was to add a group onto my page, wherever I add this, it's going to take up space on the page itself. So my group sits on the page. Now that's great for things like my header menu, where the group is always guaranteed to sit at the very top of my page. But what about when it comes to my footer menu? If I want a group that's always going to be positioned at the bottom of my page, if I have a list of 20 restaurants, you won't actually be able to see that footer menu until you scroll right down to the bottom of our page. And so that's just not going to create a great user experience if someone just wants to jump between different pages in the app. So what you can do instead is use what's known as a floating group. So in our containers menu, you'll see this option here known as a floating group. And as the name would suggest, this is a group that doesn't actually sit on your page, but instead floats over the top of your page. And if I was to just quickly change the color of this to something like red, you'll be able to see how this actually floats on your page. And the great thing about floating groups is that they will always be positioned within the viewport of a user's screen. So if I was to, let's say, position this at the bottom of my page, it's always going to float at the very bottom of a user's viewport, meaning that it will hover over whatever is being displayed at the bottom. So that just means that if a user wants to navigate between any page, they'll always see this menu within their screen. And so that's what we're going to create today. We're going to build out a reusable floating group. So I'm just going to delete this from my page and jump back over to my footer menu. I'm going to double click on this, and similar to what I just shown you, I'd like to update where this group is going to float in relation to my page. So I'm going to want this to be at the bottom of my page. Now, it doesn't really matter about the horizontal position. You can leave this as left or right. The group's going to take up the whole width of the page anyway. Now, while we're in our appearance tab, I'm also just going to scroll on down and add a solid border to this group. The reason for that is because as it floats over the top of my page, I just want to clearly distinguish that this is separate to the page itself. So this is the navigation menu, and you'll see how that's going to look in a moment. But I'll also just need to jump over to my layout tab and update, first of all, the container layout for this group. Now, inside of this footer menu, similar to our header menu, I'm going to want to display a series of elements horizontally across my page. So the container layout will in fact be a row. For the width of our UI builder, I'm going to once again set this to be 380 pixels. But of course, this will be fully responsive because the minimum width is 0 and the maximum width is infinite. And now if I was to show you an example of what this navigation menu is going to look like, I'm just going to jump back into my separate bubble editor. And this right here will give you a good insight. So as you can see, we've got these 3 different tiles here. And look, these all just have a red background, so that way you can clearly see where they sit on my page. But inside of each tile, which I should point out, each tile is actually a group. We have both an icon as well as a text element. And when someone clicks on this, we're going to build out some workflows that will send a user through to that relevant page. And so if we just jump back into our main editor here, we're going to start by adding yet another group into our existing floating group. So if I head to my containers menu, I'm going to grab a group element. I'll add this in. And the very first thing I'm going to do for this group is actually jump to my appearance tab and choose to detach the style of this. And the reason for that is because I'd like to give this a flat background color. And I'm going to set this to be a light shade of red, as you just seen in my previous example. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because if I was to set this group to be white, I actually can't really distinguish between where this group sits within my existing group. So while we're actually building our application and we're stacking groups, I'm going to update the color of these so that way we can see where everything is positioned. In my opinion, this kind of makes it like we're building with Lego blocks that we can easily see. Now, of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can set the background style to be none, so it will remove this color. But for the time being, this is just going to help us see where everything lies on our page. Now for this group, we're also going to jump to our layout tab and quickly just update the container layout here to be a column. And then from here, I'm just going to update the width settings. I'm going to make this fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width is infinite, so that way you can take up as little or as much space as possible. Now I will come back and change some of these settings in a moment, but before I do that, I'm just going to add my icon and text element into this red group. So if I scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm going to grab an icon here, I'll add this in, and I'm just going to type in the word home and reference this little home icon. Now, when it comes to this icon, I'm just going to update the color of this to be a custom color code that I have. It's a light shade of black. If you'd like this color code, it's 5D, 5D, 5D. I'm also then just going to jump to my layout tab and update the size of this icon. I'm going to make this 35 pixels by 35 pixels. And I will be leaving these as fixed values because I'm only ever going to want my icon to be this exact size, no larger and no smaller. While I'm working with this icon, I'll also horizontally align this in the center of my red group. And then below this, I'm going to add in a text element, which will display the word home. Now for this text element, I am just going to detach the style of this because I'd like to align this text in the center of the element itself. I'll then jump to my layout tab and I'll need to make this element fully responsive. So if I unselect that this should be a fixed width, I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width is infinite, which means it's now going to take up as little or as much space as it can inside of my red group. When it then comes to my height, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0, which means it will collapse around the text here. Now, theoretically, we could also fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. So that way it would also wrap around this text. But we're also going to do the exact same thing for the overall red group that this sits within. So I might actually just leave this setting as is. We will just need to horizontally align this in the center of my red group though. And now for this text element, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the bottom, 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And that is everything we'll need to add within this red group. So I'm going to select on the red group, head to my layout tab, and I'm going to start by updating the minimum height here to be 0, which means it's going to collapse around the height of our elements. And then I'm going to select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And that means it's going to collapse around the width of this element as well. Then from here, I'm going to update the vertical alignment of this group. I'm going to position this in the center of my overall floating group. And finally, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and also 10 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that when I close off all of this white space, that it won't actually touch the borders of my red group. Now finally, the last thing I'll need to do for this group is just update the name of this. I'm going to call this group home because of course this displays the option to visit the home page whenever this is clicked. And we're going to build out a workflow in a moment that actually powers that functionality. But before we do that, I'd just like to add in a few different navigation options. And thankfully, because we've already taken the time to build this existing group here, we can actually just make a copy of this. And this is going to streamline so much time having to recreate this from scratch. And so when it comes to this group, the first thing I'm going to do is update the name of this. I'm going to call this group activity. And so when someone clicks on this, it's going to take them to their activity feed, which essentially just shows them a list of all of their order history. Now, after updating the name of this group, we can easily just select on the icon, head to our appearance tab, and I'm just going to type in the word list. And I'm going to select this little list icon here. And because we've made a copy of an existing icon, I don't need to make any changes to the size or the styling of this icon. It's all been copied across. The only thing I will just need to change is the text element that's displayed below this. Instead of displaying the word home, I want this to display the word activity. And look, the size of our red group will also update accordingly. Then from here, there is just one last group I'd like to add in. So I'm going to make yet another copy of our existing red group. And for this group, I'm going to call this group account. So whenever a user selects on this group, we're going to send them through to their settings page where they can then update all of their account information. So for the icon here, I'm just going to open up my icon library and search for a user icon. I'll select the very first icon here, and I'll also just update the text below this to display the word account, and that is everything I'll need to change. Now, similar to our previous header menu, as you can see right now, all of our groups here are positioned to the left-hand side of our main floating group, whereas what I'd like to do is actually distribute these evenly across the page. So if I select on my overall floating group, I'm going to jump to my layout tab, and I'm going to update the container layout here to be the space between option. And that's now going to evenly distribute these across the group itself. While we're here, because we've finished adding all of the elements inside of this group, what I'd like to do is update the minimum height to now equal 0. And that will just close off all of that empty space that we no longer need. And that is everything we need to change when it comes to the design of this group. What I would just like to do though is build out the workflows that are going to power our navigation experience. And so if I select on our very first red group here, so this is our group home, what I'm going to do is open up my appearance tab and choose to add a workflow whenever this group is clicked. And now the beauty of having elements that sit inside of a group is that if a user clicks on any element within that group, so whether it be our icon or our text element, it will trigger the same workflow. So that's also the other benefit to using groups. So in my workflow here, it's a fairly straightforward process. What I'm going to want to do is send someone through to our homepage whenever they click on this option. So if we head down to our navigation events, I'm going to select the go to page action, and the destination page will be our index page. It truly is as simple as that. We don't need to send any data to this page. We just need to actually send someone through to that page itself. Now, while we're here, what I'm also going to do is select on my workflow trigger, and I'm going to update the event color of this to be red. And the reason for that is because within my application today, I'm going to color coordinate all of my navigation events to be red. So that way on any page, if I see a red workflow, I know it's related to a navigation feature. We'll then jump back into our design tab and we'll replicate the exact same experience for our activity option. So I'm going to select on my group activity. I'll choose to add a workflow whenever this is clicked. And within this workflow, I'll once again select from the navigation event, select the go to page action. And at this point in time, our activity page does not yet exist. So we're going to need to create a new page here. And I'm going to call this the activity page. I'll then choose to create that. Then from here in our destination dropdown, you'll see that we have the ability to reference the activity page. It's nice and straightforward. We'll also select on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be red. So that way it's color coordinated with the same feature. Finally, I'm then going to jump into my design tab once again and select our very last group here. So our group account, I'll add a workflow whenever this is clicked. I'll once again select from a navigation event, choose the go to page action, and the destination page does not yet exist. So we're going to need to create this from scratch. And I'm going to call this the settings page. I'll choose to create that. And then when I open up this drop-down menu, we'll select that the settings page should be the destination. I'll then select on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be red. And that is everything we need to build out within this navigation menu. And it's now at this point in time that we can finally add this footer menu onto our page. So if we open up our page drop-down menu, we're going to head back to our home page, so our index page. And if I once again just move my head out of the way and scroll on down to our reusable elements, we can now add our footer menu onto the page. And as you'll see, because this is a floating group that is positioned in relation to the bottom of our page, it's automatically going to be moved right down to the bottom. And if we go and take a preview of this application here, what you'll be able to see is not only our first header navigation menu being positioned on our page, but right at the bottom of our page, you'll also see our footer menu. Now, by default, when you preview your application, Bubble's going to display this debugger here at the bottom of your page, which is kind of like a floating group of itself. Now, by all means, your users won't see this menu. It's just something that's displayed when you're actually previewing your application while you build it, just so that way you can find any bugs. But if you ever want to get rid of this menu while you're actually previewing your app, you can just head up to your URL here. And after you see your page name, you'll notice a little question mark with a URL parameter. So this is known as the debug mode equals true. If you just delete that and reload your page here, you'll see that that menu will disappear. And now you'll easily be able to see your footer navigation menu. And if I was to just reduce the width of my page, you'll see that this is of course fully responsive. And let's say I want to head over to my activity page. I can select this option in my menu and it will send me through to that page, which of course at this point in time is blank because we haven't built out anything on this page. But as you'll see in the URL here, we are now viewing our activity page. Just jumping back into my Notion checklist, we can tick off that we've finished building out the last feature for our homepage. And that of course was building out both our header and footer navigation menus. And look, I know it took a long time to actually build both of these menus, but because we've created them as reusable elements, we never have to build them again. And so when it comes to displaying these on every other page in our app, it's simply just going to be a matter of dragging and dropping our reusable element onto the page. Moving down through our list of features within my Notion checklist today, I'd actually just like to skip ahead and take care of some additional housekeeping Only in this instance, we're going to start building out some of the features that empower our restaurant owners inside of our Uber Eats app. And so when it comes to the process of actually creating a restaurant listing and then adding in all of the food items that they would like to sell, I'm actually going to break this down into a few separate modules. So that way we can handle everything in bite-sized pieces. And within this very first module, we're going to build out a page that allows us to display a list of all of the restaurants that someone owns and manages. Then once we build out this page, we can focus on things like actually creating a restaurant listing, being able to edit the details of it, and then of course going on to build out the feature where we can list food items under each restaurant. And so what we're going to do is jump over into our bubble editor here. And the first thing we'll need to do is actually create a brand new page from scratch. So if we head to our page drop-down menu, I'm going to choose to add a new page, and I'm going to call this the Manage Listing page, because this is where we're going to manage restaurant listings. I can see I just had a small typo there, so I'm going to fix that, and I'll choose to now create this. Now on this page, like we've done in the past, we're just going to go ahead and take care of a few little housekeeping items before we can then add all of the elements on this page. And the very first thing we'll need to do is just double click on the page itself and update the container layout. So if we jump to our layout tab, we're going to set the container layout to be a column, because once again, we'll be stacking elements from top to bottom, so vertically on our page. I'll then also update the width of our UI builder to be 380 pixels. And this, of course, will match the width of all of our previous pages that we've built. And while we're setting up this page, I'd also like to add the reusable footer menu to the bottom of my page. And this, of course, will allow users to navigate between all of the pages within our app. So if I just move my head out of the way here, I'm going to scroll on down to my reusable elements. I'll grab my footer menu and add that onto my page. Now, I'm not going to add my header menu onto the page, because within that header menu, this is more of a consumer-facing feature where we'll be displaying the number of checkout items to a user. And look, I don't really think that's relevant to this page, so I'm actually going to delete this off. But by all means, if you want to include that on, feel free to do that. But for now, I'm just going to remove this from my page. Now, when it comes to this overall page, there's a few things I'm going to want to add to it. And I think the best way to illustrate this is just by showing you an example I prepared earlier. So if I just jump between two different bubble editors here, this is an example of everything we're going to create on this page. So at the top, you'll see we have this heading. Then below this, we have two elements positioned side by side. One is a search box and the other is a button, which when clicked, will later on build out a feature that allows someone to create a new restaurant listing. Then below this, we have a repeating group, which displays a list of all of the restaurant listings. And within that, we're displaying the featured image of that restaurant, the name of it, as well as providing the restaurant owner the ability to edit the restaurant or view it. And then finally, there's a button below that, which allows them to manage all of their orders. And when they click that later on, it's going to send them through to yet another dashboard page where they can see a list of all of their incoming orders for this specific restaurant. And so if I was to rebuild this whole page from scratch, I'll just jump back into our main bubble editor here. And I'm just going to start by adding in that header element, or I should say the heading element. So I'm just going to head to my visual elements and grab a text element here. And this is just going to display the words manage restaurant. I'll then update the font size here to be 24. I'll also bold this text. And then of course, I'll need to make this element fully responsive. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width. We will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And of course, that's going to allow this element to become as small or as large as it can possibly be on our page. I'll also update the height. If I set the minimum height to 0, we have this option selected by default, which fits the height of this element to the content inside of it. So it's going to wrap perfectly around our text. And then finally, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 pixels of margin on the left, and then 10 on the right. Now below this heading element, I'm going to add two different elements side by side, which means that in order to position elements horizontally across my page, I'm going to need to add a group and set its container layout to be a row. So in order to do that, I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu, I'll grab a group, add it onto my page here, and the first thing I'll do with this group is just jump over to my appearance tab and just attach the default style of this. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I'd like to give this group a flat background color, and I'm going to set this to be a light shade of red here. And that of course will just allow me to see where this group lies on my page while I'm working in my editor. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your app, you could remove this background color, but for the time being, I just keep it here because it's going to allow you to easily see where this lies on your page. We'll then need to make this element fully responsive and also update its container layout. So if we jump to our layout tab, we're going to update the container layout to be a row because, as I mentioned, inside of this group, I want to position 2 elements side by side, so horizontally, which means we're going to need to select the row option. I'll then update the responsive width settings by unselecting that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width is infinite. And now this group will be fully responsive regardless of how small or large the page is. And now within this group, I can add in my 2 elements. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to add an input field, which is going to act as a search box. So if, let's say, a restaurant owner has 20 restaurant listings, and instead of having to manually scroll through all of those listings to open up one particular restaurant, what I'd like to do is allow them to search for a restaurant by its title, so that way they can easily just pull up whichever restaurant they would like. And so by adding a custom search field, this is exactly something we can do. So if we scroll on down to our input forms, I'm just going to grab a standard input field here. And for this input, the first thing I'll do is just update the title of this. I'm going to call this input search. And while we're here, I'll also update the placeholder text to display the word search followed by 3 dots, just so that way a user knows that this is where they can actually search for listings. I'll then also scroll on down to the style of this and detach the default style because I'd like to set the roundness of this input field's borders to be 20, so that way it has some curved edges. And then from here, we can jump over into our layout tab. And when it comes to the width of this input field, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, but when it comes to the maximum width, I'm actually going to give this a maximum width. I'm not going to leave it as infinite. And now the reason for that is because if I jump over into my responsive tab here, as you'll see, as we expand the page out, this input field becomes quite long. In fact, it almost becomes so long that it's at the point that it doesn't really look practical. And so what I'd like to do is just set a cap on how much width this input field can take up on our page. And I'm going to set this to be 400 pixels. Now, there's no scientific reason why I selected 400 pixels. It's purely just a personal preference. If you really wanted, you probably don't even have to set this maximum width. Again, it's just a personal preference of mine, but this is just going to ensure that as our page expands out, so if for some reason someone's viewing this page on a desktop, this input field's not just going to look unnecessarily long. It's still going to look like a search field. When it comes to the height though, I'm going to leave this fixed at 48 pixels because I don't need this to expand out or shrink. I'm quite happy with the default setting. And for the margins of this input field, I'm just going to set 20 pixels of margin on the right, but I won't add any margin around any other border. Now, the reason I'm setting 20 pixels of margin on the right is because I'm about to add another element beside this, and that is of course going to be our button. So if I jump to my UI builder, we're going to head to our visual elements and add a button element into my red group. Now for this button, I'm going to have this display the words create listing. And look, for this button, we're just going to leverage the primary button style, so we won't need to make any other changes to the styling. We will just need to update the responsive settings though. So if we jump to our layout tab here, the first thing I'll do is just move this to the next position within my red group. And look, now that I think about it, to be honest, I'm quite happy to leave this button fixed at 150 pixels, which just means that at any given point in time, this is the exact width that this button will be. So it will never expand out or shrink. It's always going to be this size. I would just like to update the minimum height though. I'm going to set this to be 48 pixels, not leave it at 45. And the reason for that is because the minimum height or the actual fixed height of our input field was 48 pixels. So I want both of these elements to be the exact same height here. And that's actually all I'll need to change for this button. And it's the very last element I'll be adding into my red group. So I'm going to select on my red group here, jump to my layout tab and update the minimum height to now be 0, which means it's going to collapse nicely around both of the elements inside of it. While we're in our layout tab, I'm also going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And that will just ensure that this group doesn't touch any of the borders in my page. But another quick thing I just want to point out before we move on from this group is that within my responsive tab, if I was to expand my page out, as you'll see, my red group will continually expand out, but my button will always be positioned to the left-hand side of my screen. Now, while that doesn't look entirely wrong, just one thing I wanted to point out is that if you wanted your button to always be positioned on the right-hand side of your screen and your input field to always be positioned on the left, you could select your red group, head to the container alignment and update the option to be the space between. And now this will always just ensure that your button is positioned on the right-hand side. So there's always going to be an even amount of space between these two elements. And this is the option I'm going to use today for my red group. But that's all we'll need to add for this group. So I'm going to jump back to my UI builder here. And now what I'd like to do is display a list of restaurants that a restaurant owner manages. So in order to display a list of things, we're going to need to, of course, add a repeating group onto our page. So if I scroll on down to my containers, I'm going to grab a repeating group here. And of course, when it comes to building a repeating group, the first thing you'll need to do is give it a data source. So that way Bubble knows which list of items to display from our database. So if we jump to our appearance tab, I'm going to set the type of content to be a restaurant because I'd like to display a list of restaurants. For our data source, I'm then going to perform a search for all of the restaurants in my database where the person who created them is the current user. So that just means that the restaurant owner will see a list of all of the restaurants that they have listed. So if I select the created by field, I'm going to have this equal the current user. And of course, the current user is the person who's logged in, viewing this dashboard, and would want to see a list of all of their restaurants. Now, another thing I'd also like to do is make sure that our search field here can also impact the search results of all of the restaurants. And so what I want to do is create some sort of experience that just recognizes when someone has typed in a restaurant's name inside of this search field, from which I'll then have it update which specific restaurants are displayed in our repeating group. And the way I can do this is by adding yet another constraint onto my search here. And within this constraint, I'm only going to display restaurants where the name, I'm going to select the contains keywords option, and then I'm going to reference the value stored within our input field here. So I'm going to select the input search, its value. Now the contains keywords option will just display a list of relevant restaurants based on the keywords that someone types into this input field. So if someone was to type in the word McDonald's, all of the restaurants that contain the word McDonald's in their names would appear within this search here. But one thing I should point out is that by default, whenever this repeating group loads, a user won't always have something added into this search field. And so it's important that we select this option to ignore empty constraints here, which just means that if a user has not added a value into this input field, this constraint here would be null and void, meaning it won't impact the list of restaurants that are displayed until someone actually types in it. And that is the exact experience we'll need to create today. And look, thankfully, that's all we'll need to set up within this data source. So I'm going to choose to close this here. We'll then need to update the number of rows and columns for this repeating group. And when it comes to the number of rows, I'm going to unselect that should be a fixed number because I don't just want to display 4 restaurants. I want to display as little or as many as the restaurant owner has created. I would, however, like to leave the number of columns fixed at 1, just because I'd only like to display 1 restaurant per line item. I'll also then jump over to my layout tab. And when it comes to this repeating group, I'm going to be stacking elements inside of this vertically, so from top to bottom, which means that I'll need to set the container layout for our repeating group to be a column, and then we'll make this fully responsive on our page. So we'll jump down to our width settings. I'll unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, and that's now going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. And before we come back and update all of the height and the margin settings, we can start adding all of the elements we'll want to display inside of this repeating group. And the very first thing I'd like to showcase is the featured image of this restaurant. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, we're going to grab the image element. We'll add this into our first repeating group cell. And when it comes to the image I'd like to display, I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data, and I'll reference the current cell's restaurant, the featured image. Now, because I am working with a dynamic image, I'm going to select the more option, and I'm going to choose to process this with ImgX, so that way I can tick this option to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping them. And like always, that's just a personal preference of mine, but it's going to create a much cleaner end user experience. I'm then going to scroll on down to my styling and choose to just detach the default style, because while we're working in our editor, I'd like to add a solid border around this image. So that way when I click away, I can see exactly where this image lies on my page. The other setting I'd like to change in the styling here is just the roundness of the borders. I'd like to set this to be 5, just so that way the image has some slightly curved edges. And then from here, we can update the actual dimensions of this image. So if we jump to our layout tab, I'm going to make this element fully responsive by unselecting that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now our image will take up as little or as much space as it can within our repeating group. However, when it comes to the aspect ratio, I'm going to tick that this should be a fixed aspect ratio, and I'm going to set this to be 2:1. So that just means that the length will be twice the size of the width, and that's now always going to set this image to be a rectangle. Then finally, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And below this image, I'd like to display the name of this restaurant. So if we head to our visual elements once again, I'm going to grab a text element. I'll add this into my repeating group. And when it comes to this, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the current sales restaurant, the name. Now, one thing I should just point out is, as you saw, when I added a text element into my repeating group, it actually wasn't added into my repeating group. For some reason, it was just positioned below my repeating group. So if you try to insert dynamic data and you don't see the current cells option, that means this element doesn't actually sit inside your repeating group. So you'll just need to move it inside the repeating group itself. I'm just going to delete this though, because my text element here does sit inside of my repeating group. And the reason I know that is, of course, because I've referenced the current sales restaurant. Look, when it comes to this text, I'm then just going to scroll on down and detach the default style. And the reason for that is because I'd like to update the font size to be 16. I'll then jump to my layout tab, move this to the next position within my repeating group. So now it will sit below my image. And I'm then going to need to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. For the height, I'm going to set the minimum height to also be 0, and that will then collapse nicely around all of this text. And finally, I'll add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and also 10 on the right. And at this point, we're making great progress with our repeating group. The next thing I want to add in though is 2 buttons that are going to be positioned side by side. So if we look at my previous example here, I have one button which will allow someone to edit the details of this restaurant, and another button which will allow someone to view the restaurant listing. And so because I have 2 elements positioned side by side, as you'll see, I've added these into a red group with the container layout set to be a row. So we're going to replicate this from scratch. So if we jump back into our main bubble editor, I'm going to head on down to our containers menu and grab another group, and I'll add this within my existing repeating group here. I'll then jump to my appearance tab, and I'm just going to quickly detach the default style of this so I can give it a flat background color, and I'll set this to be a light shade of red once again, so that way I can easily distinguish where it is within my repeating group. I'll then jump to my layout tab, and I'll update the container layout to be a row, because as I mentioned, I'll be stacking 2 elements in this horizontally, so side by side. And then finally, I'll make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Now inside of this, we can add our 2 button elements, and this is pretty straightforward. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, we'll grab ourselves a button. We'll add that into our red group, and the very first button will display the word edit. Now, as you saw before, the button I want to add in should not be green. It should just be a basic shade of white with a black border around it. Now, what I could do is just attach the style here and edit a custom button. However, I'm actually going to reference a similar style throughout a later point in our tutorial as well. So what I'm going to do is create a new style. And in fact, I'm actually going to use the existing outline button style that Bubble provides. So if I was to just click away, you can see this is kind of very similar to the style that I want to build. So it's a white button with a blue outline, whereas I just like that to be a black outline with black text in the middle. So I'm going to select on this button here. I'm going to open the outline button style and choose to edit this style here. Then within this style, when it comes to the color of the text, I'm going to set this to be a shade of black, which if you'd like this color code, it's 313131. I'm then going to do the exact same thing here for the border color. I'm going to set this to be the same color. So that's 313131. And then while we're here, I'll also update the roundness of its borders to be 20. So that way it has some curved edges. And finally, if we just head over to the conditional tab here, as you'll see by default, this button has a condition when it's hovered, which is just going to fill it in with this blue color. What we could do is actually switch this out with a shade of green, similar to the real Uber Eats color. So if we wanted, we could set this to be a green color code, which is 06C167. And because this green is quite bright, I'm just going to set the opacity to be 8% here. So that way it's a bit more subtle there. And look, that's everything I want to change with this style. So I'm going to jump back to my design tab here, click away, and I can see that the condition is still active within this button. So if I quickly just jump to my appearance tab and edit the style once again, jump to my conditional tab, you can see I've got this condition turned on. So I'm just going to turn that off. And if we jump back to our design tab and click away, you'll see that this is the exact style that I want. From here though, I'm just going to click on the button and jump to my layout tab because I'd like to update the dimensions of this. And for this button, I'm still going to keep this a fixed width. However, I'd like to make this just 130 pixels. Because it's a pretty short word inside of this button, I don't need all of that space. But being a fixed width, it will always be this exact size that you see here. I'll also update the minimum height to be 40 pixels, not 45, and that'll just condense some of the height there. And then finally, I'd like to add yet another button inside of this group. And to streamline that process, I'm just going to make a copy of my existing button here. Only this time, with this button here, I'll jump to my appearance tab and update the word to display the word view. And that is all I'll need to change for these buttons right now. After adding these two buttons into my red group, I'm then going to select on the red group itself, head to my layout tab, and under my minimum height setting, I'm going to set this to be 0. So that way it will collapse nicely around both of these buttons. I'd also like both of these buttons to be pushed out to either side of my red group, which means that I'm going to have to set the container alignment here to be the space between option. And then finally, I'd like to add some margin around this group so that way it doesn't touch the borders of my page. So I'm going to head down to my margins and add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and also 10 on the right. And look, there's one very last element I'd like to add into this repeating group cell, and that is a main button, which when clicked will redirect them through to a dashboard where they can see a list of all of the incoming orders for this specific restaurant. So if we head to our visual elements, I'm going to grab a button. I'm going to add this into my repeating group here. And I can see that that's just been positioned outside of my repeating group. So I might just need to drag this in here and manually move it down. And for this button, when it comes to the text I'd like to display within this, I'm going to have this show the words manage orders, because when someone clicks on this, as I said, it's going to send them through to a page where they can actually see a list of all of their incoming orders. But what I'd also like to do in this button is display a count of how many incoming orders a restaurant owner needs to manage for this restaurant. So that way, if they're scrolling through their restaurant dashboard here, they'll be able to see that, look, there's 1 order or 2 orders that need to be prepared or managed for this restaurant. So then they can easily click this button and go and view all of those. And so in order to add that count in, what I'm going to do is add a space, an open bracket, and then I'm going to perform a search in my database. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to perform a search for all of the orders where the original restaurant that this order is linked to. So the restaurant field, when this equals the same value as the current sales restaurant. And when it comes to all of these orders, I only want to just show all of the orders that are currently in progress, not the orders that are complete, because the orders in process are the ones that need to be attended to. So if I add an additional constraint here, I'm going to recognize all of the orders where the in progress status equals yes. And for this search, what I'd like to do is perform a count of how many orders meet that criteria, and that's then going to give me a number. Then from here, I'm just going to add in a closed bracket, and that will place our number between those two brackets there. From here, I'm then going to update the style of this button, and I'm going to want to create a one-off style here. So I'm not going to edit any existing styles. Instead, I'm just going to detach this style, and I'd like to update the background color to be black, and that is all I'll need to change here. I'll then jump to my layout tab, move this to the last position within my repeating group, so that way it sits at the very bottom. And when it comes to the width of this button, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And in this case, I'd like my button to take up the entire width of our repeating group. So I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So now it is going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can within our repeating group here. And then from here, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. I'll add in 20 pixels of margin at the bottom because this is the very last element we'll be adding into our repeating group. And then of course 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 pixels of margin on the right. And because this is the very last element I'd like to add into my repeating group, I'm going to select on my overall repeating group, so my repeating group restaurant. I'll then update the minimum height here to be 0, so that will just ensure that it collapses around all of the elements inside of it there. And then finally, I just like to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, so that way there's a little bit of space between our repeating group and the search field above it there. And look, that is everything we'll need to build out on this page specifically. If we were to take a preview of this page though, what you'd see is that there's currently nothing being displayed in our repeating group. And that's because we haven't yet built out the feature to create a restaurant listing. So that just means that there will be no restaurants to display within this repeating group. And so we're going to take a preview of this page once we build that feature out. But there is one last thing I just want to cover within this section of our tutorial, and that is how we can create a way for restaurant owners to actually navigate to this page. So within our footer menu, we're just going to add an additional menu option which sends someone through to this page where they can manage their restaurant listings. So if we open up our page drop-down menu, we're going to head to our footer menu. And in order to streamline the process of building out another menu option, I'm just going to select on our middle tile here and make a copy of this. I'll then double click on this and just move this to the previous position. I want this to be positioned before our account tile. And look, when it comes to this group, I'm also going to update the name of this to be called Group Listings, because when this is clicked, it's going to send someone through to our Manage Listings page that we've just created. If I select on the icon, I'm going to head to my Appearance tab and just update the icon here. And I'm just going to type in the word cutlery, and I'm going to select this little knife and fork here. I'll then click on the text here and update this to display the word listings. And of course, we'll now need to create a workflow that runs whenever this menu option is selected. So if I click on my red group, I'm going to choose to add a workflow whenever this is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm going to select from a navigation event, choose the go to page action, and I'll send someone through to our listing page that we've just created. So that is our manage listing. Now, because this workflow is a navigation event, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger, and I'll also update the event color here to be red. So that way we know it's related to our previous workflows as well. And the very last thing we'll need to do is create a condition on this group that only allows it to be displayed to those users who are restaurant owners. Because when you think about it, if a user is just a consumer or a delivery driver, they shouldn't actually see this option. So they shouldn't have the ability to go to our manage listing page. It's only our restaurant owners that should. So in order to do that, we're going to select on this overall red group. So our group listings. We're going to first of all then jump to our layout tab, and we're going to unselect that this should be visible on page load, which means it's going to be invisible to anyone. I'll also select this option to collapse this group when it's hidden. So that just means that when it's not being displayed, it's not going to take up any empty space here. But what we'll now need to do is head over to our conditional tab and create a condition that allows us to display this to users who are restaurant owners. And look, if you're not too familiar with conditions in Bubble, they're just a way of creating some sort of pattern that happens whenever a certain behavior is met inside of your app. So in this case today, we're going to define a condition, and we're just going to recognize when the current user, so that is the person who is logged in, when their account type is a restaurant owner. So this is linked to our option set. What I'm then going to do is recognize when this behavior is true, I'm going to select that this element should be visible and tick that that should also be true. And if you'd like, you can toggle this condition on and off to see how this behavior is going to look whenever it is true. And so now you'll see that when someone is a restaurant owner, this will be visible within their account. And look, that is everything we'll need to build out when it comes to this feature. As I said, I'm not going to run a preview of this page right now, just because we don't have any restaurant listings to show. However, we will come back and take a preview of this whole experience in a moment. For the time being though, I'm just going to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out the feature to manage a restaurant listing. And again, I know this isn't really one of the core user-facing features of our app today, but it's definitely an essential bit of housekeeping to power the rest of our experience. Scrolling down my list of features within my checklist here, we're going to move on to the feature where we can now create a restaurant listing. And of course, this is another essential feature in order to power our Uber Eats clone today. And look, thankfully, this one is fairly straightforward. There's not too many technical complexities involved in the process. But of course, I'm going to be sure to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as I can. So if we were to jump over into our Bubble editor here, we're going to open up the Manage Listing page. So this is the page that we previously just created. And you might remember in the top right hand corner of this page, we had this button here known as the Create Listing. And now when it comes to the experience I want to create today, whenever a restaurant owner clicks this button here, I'd like to display a pop-up on the page, which just allows them to store the information of a restaurant that they want to create. And then once they do create that restaurant, it will become visible in this repeating group of restaurants that they own. And so in order to power this experience, I'm going to scroll on down and I'm going to head to my containers menu. I'm going to grab a pop-up and I'm going to add this to the page. Now, when it comes to this pop-up, if you wanted to see a quick example of what we're going to be building, I have an example over in an existing bubble editor here. So if I just open up this pop-up, this is what we're going to recreate today. So you can see we're going to be storing information about the restaurant's name, its address, its categories, its description, as well as a logo and a featured image. And so this pop-up is a fairly straightforward process to build out. So if we just jump back into our main bubble editor, the first thing I'm going to do is actually update the name of this pop-up. I'm going to call this pop-up create listing. Then from here, I'm going to head to my layout tab because I'd like to set the container layout for a pop-up. Now, if you're not familiar with pop-ups in Bubble, they're kind of like a group that actually just hovers over the top of your page. Now, by default, a pop-up is not visible when the page is loaded. So if we were to reload this page here, the pop-up would be hidden. It's only when you call it within a workflow that it will be displayed. And of course, if you want to be able to edit this pop-up, you'll need to scroll on up to your elements tree here, and you'll see that your pop-up is currently hidden. So when you click on this, it will then display it. And now when it comes to the container layout of this pop-up, as you'd seen in the example I just shown you, we're going to be stacking elements from top to bottom, which means we're going to need to set the container layout to be a column. I'm also going to make this pop-up fully responsive. So if I unselect that this should be a fixed width, I'm going to set the minimum width to 0, and I'm not going to leave the maximum width as infinite, because right now, as you'll see, it's taking up the entire width of my page. So what I'm going to do is set the maximum width to be 380 pixels, which is the exact same width as the page itself. Now we will come back and update the height settings in a moment, but before we do that, I'd like to add all of the elements I want to display inside of this pop-up. And the very first element is going to be a heading. So if we head to our visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element here. I'm going to add this into my pop-up, and I'm going to have this display the words create a new restaurant. And when it comes to this text, because I'd like this to be a larger heading, I'm going to update the font size here to be 24. I'll also choose to bold this text. Then I'm going to jump into my layout tab and make this fully responsive. So like always, when it comes to a text element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'm also then going to update my minimum height to be 0, so that way it collapses around all of the text inside of it. And then finally, I'd like to add in some margins around this text element, so that way it doesn't touch the borders of my pop-up. So I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top. I won't add any on the bottom, but I'll also add in 10 on the left and 10 on the right. Then from here, below this text element, I'd like to add yet another, and perhaps a way to streamline that whole process is just by making a copy of our existing heading. If I jump to my appearance tab though, I'm going to update this text to display the words restaurant name. But when it comes to this text element, I won't want it to be as big as my main heading. So I'm just going to update the font size to be 16, but I'll still keep this as bold. I'd also just like to add a little bit more space between both of these text elements. So in my layout tab, I'm just going to update the top margin here to be 30 pixels instead of 20. But when it comes to our responsive settings, I'm going to keep all of these the same. And once we've finished editing this text element, I'm going to add my very first input field, which of course will allow a restaurant owner to store the name of a new restaurant. So if I scroll on down to my input forms, I'm just going to grab a standard input field here and add this in. And when it comes to this input field, I'm going to update the name of this to be called input create name, because this is where we're creating the name of a restaurant. While we're in our appearance tab, I'm also just going to scroll on down and update the roundness of this input field's borders. I'm going to set this to be 20, so that way it has some curved edges. And of course, we'll then need to make this fully responsive as well. So if we jump to our layout tab, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. As you probably guessed, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width is infinite. When it comes to the height, I'm going to keep this fixed at 48 pixels. I don't need this to be any larger or smaller. I'm happy with it always being this exact size. But finally, I would just like to add some margins on both the left and right hand side of this input. So I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 pixels of margin on the right. Now below this, I'd like to add yet another input field, but in that field, I'd like someone to be able to store the address of this restaurant. So in order to streamline this process, I'm actually just going to make a copy of our heading here. So this is our restaurant name. Only this time I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'm just going to have this display the word address. I'll then jump to my layout tab. And when it comes to the top margin, I'm going to set this to be 20 pixels again, not 30, just because I think that's enough space between my input field and this text element. Now, when it comes to storing the address of a restaurant, I'm not going to use just a standard input field. Instead, I'm going to use a search box. So if I scroll on down to my input forms, I'm going to grab a search box here and I'll add this into my pop-up. And first of all, when it comes to this search box, I'm going to update the name of this to be called search box create address. So that way when we build out the workflows to create a restaurant, I know that this is the input field I should reference. Now the reason I've used a search box is because if we were to head over to our choices style here, and if we open up this drop down menu, you'll see this option to reference the geographic places. And what that does is it automatically creates an integration with Google Maps. So right now, this will fetch and display real world addresses from Google Maps. So as someone starts typing in an address, it's going to show a list of suggested addresses from Google Maps, in which case someone can then easily select on any of those addresses. Now, another thing I should point out when you're working with geographic places is that at the top of our editor here, you might notice that we have two issues. And if we were to click on this, what you'll see is the bubble's prompting us to add in our own Google Maps API keys. And so what does that actually mean? Because we're pulling information from Google Maps, Bubble's going to require you to set up your own API keys so that way you can pull real world address information into your own app. And so if we were to select on these issues, what you'll see is it's going to redirect us through to our settings tab and open up our general settings. And if we scroll on down, what you'll see here under your general services API keys is two fields where you'll need to add in your own Google Maps API keys. Now, please don't stress because this is a super straightforward process. But this is 100% mandatory in order to power your application today. You will need to do this. And in order to actually source these API keys, it couldn't be any easier. If you just select on this little link here, which opens up the documentation that Bubble has created, what you'll see is that within this guide, there is a long list of steps that you can follow. And if we scroll on down here, you'll see there is a step-by-step video tutorial that Bubble provides on how you can actually source these API keys. And there's even screenshots of everything you'll need to do. So in order to source these API keys, what you'll need to do is actually create your own Google developer account, which they provide a link in this document to do. Then you'll need to create your own API keys, which honestly just includes you clicking a few buttons. And then you'll just need to enable all of these API services here. And so once you source your API keys, you'll paste in the values of those into the relevant fields here. And so what I'd recommend doing is actually pausing this tutorial right now and watching the video guide that Bubble has provided, so that way you can source your own API keys now. Because if you don't do this and we go to preview our application, any feature that relies on addresses or real world location data will not work. So please, please, please take the time to do this now. Once you've done that though, we can jump back into our design tab. I'm just going to close this tab in my browser. And what we can do is finish building out this search box. So if we just scroll on down within our appearance tab, I'm just going to update the roundness of its borders to be 20. So that way it also has some curved edges like our previous input field. And then from here, I'll jump over into our layout tab and make this input field fully responsive as well. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. Then when it comes to the height, I'm quite happy to leave this fixed at 48 pixels. But for the margins, similar to our previous input field above, I'm going to set the left margin to be 10 pixels and the right margin to also be 10 pixels. And that is all we'll need to configure for this input field. The next field I'd like to add below this is just going to allow restaurant owners to select the relevant categories they'd like to store within this restaurant. And so once again, in order to streamline that process, I'm going to start by making a copy of this existing text element. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'm just going to have this display the word categories. Then below this, I'd like to add in an input field which displays a list of all of our categories stored within our option set list. So if I just quickly digress and jump over to my data tab and open up my option sets menu, what you'll remember is we have this list of categories here. So this is everything like alcohol, seafood, pizza, and so on. And so what I'd actually like to do today is create an experience where a restaurant owner can select from multiple categories that are relevant to their restaurant listing. And so if I was to jump into my design tab, traditionally for something like this, I'd use something like a drop-down menu. So that way a user or a restaurant owner can open up the menu and see a list of all of the options that they can choose from. However, the downside to using just a standard drop-down menu is that you can only select one option. Whereas in this instance today, I'd like my restaurant owners to be able to select from multiple options. And so how can we do that? Thankfully, there is another free plugin we're going to install that's built by Bubble, and it's known as a multi-drop-down field. So it functions exactly like a drop-down. However, as the name would suggest, it just allows users to select multiple options. So if we jump to our plugins tab here, we're going to open up our plugins library once again, and we're just going to type in the word multi. Then the plugin we're going to install is this multi-select drop-down plugin, which is a free plugin built by Bubble. I'll then choose to close my plugin library. jump back to my design tab, and if I scroll on down to my input forms, you'll now see we have this option to add in a multi dropdown. So I'm going to add this below our text. And first of all, I'm just going to update the name of this. I'm going to call this multi dropdown create categories. And then from here, what you'll see is that this input field functions very much the same as a drop-down menu. So you can choose to display a list of static options or a list of dynamic choices. And in this instance, I'd like to reference the dynamic choices stored within our option set list. So I'm going to select on the dynamic choices here. Then we'll just need to identify what type of items we'll want to display within this drop-down menu. And this is going to be our categories option set. Then for all of the categories I'd like to show, it's super straightforward. It's just going to be all of the categories. So all of the options within my list. And then for the caption, so the text itself that's displayed for each category, it's just going to be the current option set, it's display text. It's super straightforward. I'm then just going to scroll on down and update the roundness of this input field's borders to be 20. So that way it matches all of my existing input fields. I'll then jump over to my layout tab here, and I'll need to make this element fully responsive. So as you probably guessed, that means I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width is infinite. And when it comes to the minimum height here, I'm going to set this to be 48 pixels, just because that is the same height as all of my existing input fields on my pop-up. Now, one thing I should also point out is that what you'll see is that when it comes to our height here, we're not leaving this as a fixed height. Instead, I'm going to leave the maximum height as infinite. And the reason for that is because with a multi drop-down field, there's no telling how many options a user will select. And if they select more options than what can actually fit in this input field, I want it to continually expand down and actually fit all of those in. And so by leaving the maximum height as infinite, it will allow us to do just that. I'm then also going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right. So that way our input field is in line with all of our existing input fields on our pop-up. And we're about halfway through the pop-up right now. There's still just a few little fields I want to add in. The next one is going to allow a restaurant owner to store a description for this restaurant listing. So once again, I'm going to select on my text element, make a copy of that. And if I just jump to my appearance tab, I'm going to update this text to display the word description. Then I'm going to need to add an input field below this. So if I head to my input forms, I'm not going to use just a standard input field. Instead, I'm going to use what's known as a multi-line input field. So a multi-line input field, as the name would suggest, allows you to just add in multiple lines of text as opposed to just one line of text. So it pretty much functions the exact same as a regular input field. Only a multi-line input field will continually expand down if more text needs to be added into it. And this is perfect for things like long form descriptions or bios. And so that's why I'm going to use this element here. The first thing I'll do when it comes to this element is of course just update the name of this. I'm going to call this multi-line input create description. I'll then scroll on down to my borders and update the roundness of its borders to be 20. Then from here, I'm going to jump over into my layout tab, move this to the next position within my group. And of course, we'll update the responsive settings of this element as well. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width is infinite. Then for the minimum height, I'm going to set this to be 48 pixels, which is the same height as my existing input fields. But of course, when it comes to the maximum height, I'm going to leave that as infinite. So that way, regardless of how much text someone adds into this input field, it will continually expand down and fit all of that in. I'm then also just going to add the same margins to both the left and the right hand side of this input field. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right. Now finally below this, there is just one last section I'd like to add into my pop-up, and that is a way for a restaurant owner to upload a logo for this restaurant as well as a featured image. And if I was to just open up my previous example that I'd shown you, what you'll see is that I'm using two different picture uploader elements, and these are positioned side by side. So in order to horizontally align these two elements together, what I've done is I've added a new group inside of my pop-up, and then inside of that, I've added two additional groups. And so in order to replicate this experience, we're going to head on up to our containers menu, grab a group, add this into my pop-up. And when it comes to this group, the first thing I'm going to do is jump to my appearance tab. I'm going to detach the default style because I'd like to give this a flat background color. And I'm going to make this a light shade of red so that way I can easily distinguish where this group sits in my pop-up. I'll then jump to my layout tab. And when it comes to the container layout, I'm going to set this to be a row because as I just mentioned, I want to stack two elements side by side within this group. We'll then also need to make this element fully responsive. But before I do that, I'm just going to move this to the next position within my pop-up. so that way it's positioned at the very bottom. I'll then unselect that this should be a fixed width. As you probably guessed, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now inside of this group, I'd like to add 2 additional groups. And the reason for that is because back in my example here, what you'll see is that between each picture uploader, I have a little text heading above it. And so this just indicates what type of image someone should upload to each picture uploader. Now, because this heading is stacked vertically on top of our picture uploader, what I'm going to need to do is add a group into my existing red group and set this new group's container layout to be a column. So that way I can stack 2 elements on top of each other. And so if we just jump back into our main bubble editor, I'm going to head on up to my containers menu and grab yet another group here. I'll jump to my appearance tab. And when it comes to this group, I'm going to once again detach the style of this. I'll update the background color to be a flat color. And I'm going to set this to be a light shade of green, just so that way, again, I can easily see where it sits on my page. I'll then need to jump to my layout tab. And for the container layout of this group, I'm going to set this to be a column because as I mentioned, I'll be stacking 2 elements on top of each other. I'll then also make this fully responsive. So if I unselect that this should be a fixed width, I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And we are going to come back and update the width and the height settings in a moment. But before we do that, I'd just like to add in both my text element and my picture uploader itself. So when it comes to the text element, in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to select on our existing text element here, click in my green group and paste in a version of this. I'll then jump to my appearance tab and update this text to display the word logo, because below this is where we're going to allow someone to upload the logo of their restaurant. Now, if I also quickly just jump back into my layout tab, I'm just going to remove all of the margins around this text element here. So I'm just going to reset all of these to 0. Then below this, I'm going to add in my picture uploader element. So under my input forms, I'm going to grab a picture uploader. I'll add this in here. And for this picture uploader, I'm going to call this create logo. It's nice and straightforward. And look, for the dimensions of this picture uploader, I'm going to set the width to be 100 pixels and the height to also be 100 pixels. So now it is slightly smaller, but it's still a perfect square. And I'm going to keep both of these as fixed values because I'm only ever going to want it to be this exact size. So 100 pixels by 100 pixels. Now, after adding both of these elements into my green group, I'm going to select on the group itself, jump back to my layout tab, and first of all, set the minimum height to now be 0, which means it's going to collapse vertically around both of my elements inside of this group. And then what I'm also going to do is select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, which means it's now going to horizontally collapse around both of these elements as well. And this is how I can add in my first group. And to be honest, when it comes to the process of adding in my second group, it's going to be much the same. In fact, what I'm actually going to do is make a copy of my existing group here, then click in my red group once again and paste in another version of this. But of course, when it comes to this second group, I'll just need to update the text that's displayed at the top of the group. So instead of displaying the word logo, I'd like to have this display the word featured image. Because as you've probably guessed, within this group, we're going to allow a restaurant owner to upload a featured image that will be displayed on their listing. From here, I'm going to select on the picture uploader within our new group, and I'm just going to quickly update the title of this to be called Picture Uploader Create Featured Image. And of course, I'll need to update the size of this because our featured image is going to be a long rectangle, not a perfect square. So if we just jump over into our layout tab, when it comes to the width of this picture uploader, I'm going to set this to be 200. So that means its aspect ratio is 2:1. And that is all I'll need to change for this picture uploader here. The last thing I'd like to do is just add in a little bit of space between both of these groups. So if I select on my picture uploader, right click on this again and choose to select its first parent, it's now going to open up my group. And the reason why the group is called the parent is because our picture uploader sits inside of that group, which means that that group is taking care of that element. So it's like the parent for that element. What we're going to do is first of all, just quickly jump to our appearance tab, and I might just update the background color to be a light shade of blue. So that way I can easily distinguish between these two groups. I'll then jump to my layout tab, and for this group, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left here. And now that will add some nice spacing between both groups. I can then select on my overall red group, open up my layout tab, and set the minimum height to be 0. And that of course is then going to collapse around both of my groups that sit inside of it. And finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, and also 10 on the right, which will just ensure that it sits in line with all of my existing input fields. And just like that, that is the very last set of input fields I'd like to add to this pop-up. What I'd like to now do is add a button element in my pop-up and build out a workflow that's going to run whenever that is clicked. And of course, within that workflow, I'd then like to create a restaurant. So in order to do that, I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I'm going to grab a button. I'll add this into my pop-up, and I'm going to have this button display the words create listing. Now, one thing I should just point out is that if I was to quickly close this pop-up, you might remember that we already have an existing button called button create listing. So what I'm going to need to do is update the name of my second button here, which is called the exact same thing. So that way, when I build out my workflows, I can easily distinguish between both of these buttons. So I'm going to call this create listing publish, because this is where we're going to be publishing a new restaurant listing. I'm then going to quickly just jump to my layout tab, move this button to the last position within my pop-up. So that way it sits at the bottom. I'd then like to update the width settings of this button. So that way it takes up the entire width of our pop-up. So if I unselect that this should be a fixed width, I'll just set the minimum width to be 0 and of course leave the maximum width as infinite. For the height, I'm quite happy to leave that at 45 pixels. But when it comes to the margins, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top. I will add in 20 pixels of margin at the bottom because this is the very last element we'll add inside this pop-up. And I'll also add in 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right here. Now, because this is the last element we're going to add into this pop-up, I'm going to select on the pop-up itself, jump to my layout tab and just update the minimum height here to be 0, which will just ensure that it collapses nicely around all of the elements inside of it. And now before we go on to build out the workflow that actually creates a restaurant listing, we're going to need to first of all create the workflow that will display this pop-up. Because if you remember, as I'd mentioned, a pop-up is not visible on your page by default. You need to reference it within a workflow. So if I just click away from this pop-up and close it, I'm going to select on my create listing button here, open up my appearance tab, and I'm going to choose to run a workflow whenever this button is clicked. And thankfully within this workflow, it's a super straightforward process. I only want to do one thing, and that is display my pop-up. So what I'm going to do is select from our element actions, and I'm going to choose to show an element, and that element will be our pop-up create listing. Now, because this workflow is going to be related to the process of creating a listing itself, I'm going to select on my workflow trigger and update the event color here to be green. So that way later on when I build out any additional workflows on this page, I can easily distinguish that this is related to this specific feature. We'll then jump to our design tab, head to our elements tree and choose to open up our pop-up. And from here, we can actually build out the workflow that's going to run whenever someone clicks on our create listing button here. So we're going to choose to add a new workflow. And within this workflow, we're going to do a couple of different things. The first thing we're going to do is of course create a new restaurant listing in our database. So if we head on down to our data tab, we're going to choose to create a new thing. Now that type of thing is going to be a restaurant. And from here, we'll need to match all of the data fields in our database with the relevant input fields on our page. So I'm going to select this option to add in all of my fields, and this is where we can just pair everything together. So for our address, I'd like this to equal the value of the search box on our pop-up. So the search box create address, its value. For the categories, I'd like to add a list of items, because if you remember in our database, the categories is a list of option sets. So I'm going to add a list of items, and that list is of course stored in our multi drop-down create categories, so its value. The description, it's going to be the multi-line input create description. And as always, you can see how easy it is to actually match these fields when you have the right naming conventions for your inputs. It just saves you a ton of time having to guess which input field is related to which data field. For the featured image, I'm going to reference the picture uploader, create featured image. For the logo, it'll be our picture uploader, create logo. And then for our name, it'll just be the input, create name. Now at this point in time, if someone was to click this button, this workflow would run and it would create a new restaurant listing in our database, but nothing else would change. Whereas what I'd like to do is actually close this pop-up, so that way the restaurant owner can now see that new listing within our repeating group. And I'd also just like to reset the values of all of these input fields within our pop-up. So that way, if a restaurant owner is brand new to our app and they want to add multiple listings at once, I don't want them to select this button, create a listing, and then close that pop-up, only to then select this button again, have this pop-up open, and then have all of the previous information from their last restaurant listing still within this. So I'm going to reset the value of all of these input fields once we no longer need that information. So within my workflow tab, I'm going to add an additional step within my workflow here. And what we're going to do is head to our element actions, and we're going to choose to hide an element. And that element is going to be a pop-up. Then from here, I'm going to add one last step, and I'm just going to type in the word reset, and I'm going to choose to reset all of the relevant input fields, which, as I just mentioned, will clear out all of the existing information stored in those input fields. Now, once again, because this workflow is related to our feature where we're going to create a restaurant listing, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger itself and update the event color here to be green. So now I can see that these two workflows are related to the same feature. And thankfully, that is actually everything I wanted to cover within this section of our tutorial today. What I'd love to do is just show you a quick preview of how this page is going to look from the process of creating a new restaurant listing and then viewing that listing on the page itself. Over in a preview of my application here, I'm just going to reduce the size of my browser so that way it looks more like a mobile device. I'm going to choose to create a new listing, and then from here I'm going to add in all of the details of this restaurant. I'm going to call this restaurant La Pasta. I'll then add in an address. I'll select this address here in San Francisco, and as you'll see, because I've integrated my Google Maps API keys, I have the ability to reference real-world addresses. For the categories, look, I don't really have a relevant category to this kind of restaurant, perhaps pizza, and maybe let's say we serve alcohol as well. Then for the description, I'm just gonna say the best pasta and pizza in town. And for our logo, I'll upload this from my local device here. And once I've uploaded my logo, I'll do the exact same thing for my featured image. Now from here, I can choose to go ahead and create this listing. And what you'll see is that workflow will run, it will close our pop-up, it will create a listing in our database, and now we'll be able to see this listing directly on our page where we can manage a list of all of our restaurants that we own. Just jumping back into my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we've finished building out the feature to actually now create a restaurant listing. Thankfully, there wasn't too much involved within this process. But now at this point in time, you'll be able to see your application slowly start to come together, because on things like your homepage, if you ever wanted to view a list of restaurants nearby, these should now be displayed. Moving down our list of features inside of my checklist here, the next thing I want to cover is how we can build out a custom search feature, which is going to allow someone to search for restaurants either by a food category or the actual name of a restaurant. Now look, thankfully this one is a fairly straightforward feature to build out. So what we're going to do is jump over into our bubble editor here. And within our editor, we're going to open up our index page. So this is the home page that we had originally created. Now on this home page, you might remember at the top of the page here, we had this input field, which I mentioned was going to act like a search box. And within this field, we've prompted someone to type in the name of a restaurant that they would like to search for. And so what I'd now like to do is start by building out a workflow whenever someone actually types something into this field, from which we're then going to send that user through to a search results page and display a list of relevant restaurants that match that user's search query. And so in order to do this, we're going to start by jumping over to our workflow tab, and we're going to build out a brand new workflow from scratch. So I'm going to select on a new workflow trigger, and if we head to our element triggers, we're going to recognize when the value of an input is changed. So when someone types something into this input field, we want this workflow to run. Now the element we're going to reference is of course our input home search, which is our input field I've just mentioned. And within this workflow, we're going to send someone through to a search results page, which at this point in time does not yet exist within our app. So we're going to need to create that. So if we select to add an action, we're going to choose from the navigation events and select the go to page action. And as I mentioned, the destination page does not exist. So we're going to create a brand new page from scratch, and I'm going to call this the search page. I'll then choose to create this. And now from our drop-down menu, we can select that that should be the destination page. And so that's how we can actually send someone through to this page. But of course, we're missing something important here. We need to also send through the user's search query, so that way we know which specific restaurants to display that will match their search. And so how can we do that? In Bubble, there's a few different ways in which you can send data between pages. In the past, I've explained how we could set a type of content on the page and then send it through this traditional sense, so where we're sending data. But the problem with that is when you're sending data, you're going to have to send through the value of a specific item in your database. So it would be one restaurant. But what would happen if, let's say, a user wants to search for all of the McDonald's restaurants nearby them? In that case, we wouldn't want to just display one listing, we'd want to display all of the listings that have the word McDonald's within the title. And so this traditional way of sending data through is not going to be suitable. So instead, we're going to use an alternative approach, which is known as sending page parameters. So if you were to scroll right down to the bottom of this workflow step here, you'll see this little checkbox, which is known as the send more parameters to the page. Now, if we check this, it's going to open up this option where we can add a parameter within our URL. Now, although a parameter might sound confusing if you're brand new to Bubble, I'm almost confident that at some point in your time throughout the internet, you've interacted with a page parameter. And in fact, if you were to look at the URL of your Bubble editor here, you can see a long list of parameters. So if I just open up this URL, we'll see we have the main Bubble domain. So this is bubble.io. We then have the page that we're currently viewing. And then what you'll notice is that we have this little question mark here, followed by a long string of different characters. And these are our URL parameters. So URL parameters are just a way of storing data within your URL. So that way you can not only send data into your URL, but you can then extract it at any point in time. And so when it comes to every parameter, it's going to store two bits of information. There's the name of the parameter, and then there's the information you're storing within each parameter. And so what you'll see here is that the name of my first parameter is the name of my page. So it's just called name. And the page that I'm currently viewing is the index page, because as you'll see here from my page drop-down menu, we have the index page open. We then have another parameter, which is called the ID. So this is the actual app ID for my application here. And what you'll see is that when it comes to the data that's stored in this parameter, it's just the name that I've given my application inside of Bubble. And then finally, you'll see there's one last parameter known as the tab. And you can see right now that I'm currently viewing tab number 2 because I've opened up my workflow tab. Now, if I was to update this to, let's say, view tab number 3, I'm going to refresh this page here. And what you'll see is that it's going to reload my Bubble editor and it's going to pull that data from my URL. I'm just going to quickly close this because what you'll now see is that we've opened up tab number 3. So this is our data tab. And so this is how URL parameters work. As I mentioned, you can send and store data in your URL and then have your application respond based on the information stored within it. And so if we just jump back to our workflow tab here and open up our workflow we were just creating, what we're going to need to do is send through the parameter. And within that parameter, I'd like to send and store the search query that someone has typed into our input field. And so as you'll see here, the first thing we'll need to do is give our parameter a key. Now, a key is essentially just the name of the parameter. So in this case, I'm going to call the key the query because a user is performing a search query here. Then after giving this parameter a name, you'll see the ability to actually store the data you want inside your URL. And in this case, what I'd like to do is just store the search query that someone has typed into our input field. So I'm just going to reference this input field, its value. It's super straightforward. Now, because this workflow is related to our search experience, what I'm going to do is select on the workflow trigger here and update the event color to be purple. So that way I can easily differentiate between both of these workflows. And now from here, once we've sent a user through to our search results page, we're going to need to actually build that page out. So that way we can display a list of relevant restaurants based on a user's search query. So if we jump back into our design tab, open up our page drop-down menu and head over to our newly created search page. Before we actually build out this page, we're obviously just going to need to take care of some housekeeping. So if we just double click on the page, we're going to update the container layout for this first. So within our layout tab, I'm going to set the container layout here to be a column because I'd like to stack elements on this from top to bottom. I'll then also update the width of my UI builder to be 380 pixels. So that way it is the same width of all of my existing pages. And then from here, I'd also like to add my header menu as well as my footer menu. So I'm just going to move my head out of the way here. We can scroll on down to our reusable elements, and I'll start by adding my header menu onto this page. Because this is a page that consumers are going to interact with, I'm going to want to display this menu at the top, and I'll also add my footer menu down at the bottom. Now, just like that, with the click of a few buttons, you can already start to see our page come together quite nicely. But from here, the very first element I'd like to add onto my page is just going to be a heading which just relays the user's search query back to them. So what I'm going to do is extract the information sent to my URL parameter, and I'm going to display this on the top of my page, so that way the user knows that their search query was successful. So I'm just going to move my head back over to the other side of the screen. I'm going to scroll it up to my visual elements, and I'm going to grab a text element here and add this to my page. And when it comes to this text element, I'm just going to add in an apostrophe. Then I'm going to extract the search query that they've sent through to this page. And so in order to do that, I'm going to insert dynamic data. And if I type in the word URL, you'll see this option to get data from your page URL. And what you'll then notice is that you have the ability to extract a parameter. So this is where you need to reference the parameter name. Now, one thing I should point out is that the way in which you spell your parameter here will need to be the exact same as the way you've spelt it when you sent that data through. So I know for a fact my parameter is called query, and it's in all lowercase letters, because when I'd actually sent this parameter through, I'd spelt it in all lowercase letters. If I was to, at this point in time, add a capital Q here for query, this parameter would no longer match with the exact parameter that I'd sent through. And the reason for that is because the values are not the same. So that means that I would not be able to actually create a successful match and extract the parameter from a URL. So one thing I just want to point out is that you will just need to make sure these are spelt the exact same. If it helps, you could even just copy and paste the first value across. But I just know for a fact I like to spell mine in all lowercase letters, so that way I have some consistency. Then from here, I'm going to choose to close this. And then what this is going to do is actually display the user's search query. So if they searched for a restaurant, it will display that restaurant's name. I'm then going to select into my field and add another apostrophe there. And that is all I would like to add within this text element. I would just like to scroll on down and detach the default style of this, because I'd like to update the font size of this to be 18. And I'd also like to bold this text, so that way it stands out as a heading at the top of my page. I'll then jump to my layout tab here, because I'd like to make this text element fully responsive. So like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this text element is going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. I'll also update the minimum height to be 0, so that way it collapses around all of the text inside of it there. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left and 10 on the right. Now below this text element, I'd like to add in a repeating group that's going to display a list of all of the restaurants with the name that matches the same search query that a user has sent through. And now instead of having to rebuild this entire repeating group from scratch, what we're going to do is actually make a copy of the repeating group on our home page and then just update the data source of that. So if we open up our page drop-down menu, we're going to jump back over to our index page here. And I'm going to select on my repeating group. So this is my repeating group restaurant. I'm going to make a copy of this. I'll then jump back over to my search page. I'll select on the page and paste in a version. And just like that, it saved us a ton of time having to rebuild all of these elements from scratch. The only thing we will just need to do though is update the data source for this repeating group, because of course that will determine which restaurants should be displayed within our list. And so what we're going to do is open up our appearance tab here. And if I was to open up our data source, what you'll see is that because we've copied this across from the home page, it has the same data source, which is just displaying a list of restaurants where the address is within 10 kilometers of the current user's location. Now I'm quite happy to leave this constraint here because of the restaurants I will display on our search results page. I just want to make sure they are still within a certain proximity to the current user. But what I'd also like to do is add an additional constraint here, and I'd like to display only restaurants where the title of those matches the same search query that was sent through within our URL parameter. So I'm going to reference a restaurant where the name of this, and in this instance, I'm going to use the contains keywords option. If you use the contains option, it is case sensitive. So if, for instance, someone was to type in McDonald's with a lower M, or they didn't capitalize the D, no listings would display. Whereas if you use contains keywords, it will not be case sensitive. So it's more likely to display the listings that you need. So I'm going to use the contains keywords option. And where am I going to get these keywords from? Of course, they're stored in our URL. So I'm going to need to, once again, get data from my page URL. So if I just type in the letters URL, we will select this last option to get data from our page URL. And the parameter is going to be my query, which is spelled in all lowercase letters. I can then choose to close this here, and you'll see that that will validate. And that is everything we'll need to change for this data source here. So I'm then going to choose to close this. And at this point in time, you would actually have a fully functional search results page. However, like everything in this tutorial today, there's one last thing we'll need to factor in. And that is that from our homepage, there's not going to be just one way to search for restaurants, but there's actually going to be two. If we were to open up our page drop-down menu and head back to our index page here, not only do we have this input field, which allows someone to type in a query, but above that, we have a list of categories that we were displaying from our option set list. And so whenever someone actually selects on a particular category, what I'd like to do is also send them through to our search results page. And on that search results page, I'd like to display all of the restaurants that are nearby that fit that category. So what we're going to do is create yet another workflow that's going to run whenever someone clicks on one of these categories, and we're going to send them through to our search results page. So if I select on this image within our category here, I'm going to choose to add a new workflow. And within this workflow, we're going to replicate the exact same process as the very first workflow we built. So we're going to head to a navigation event, select the go to page action. And when it comes to the destination page, this will be our search page. And we'll also need to send through a URL parameter. So I'm going to tick this option to send through more parameters. And then I'm going to choose to add my own parameter. And for the name of this parameter, I'm going to call this category. And just keep in mind, I'm spelling this in all lowercase letters. Then for the category I'd like to send through, I'm going to send through the current sales category, its display, which is the name of that category. Now, because once again, this workflow is related to my search feature, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger and update the event color here to be purple. We'll then need to jump over to our search page, so that way we can update the data source of our repeating group to reflect this search here. So if I open up my page drop-down menu, we'll jump back to our search page and open our design tab. Now, before we even update the data source of our repeating group, what I'd like to do is actually, first of all, update the data source of this text element. Because if you remember, this text element was displaying the user's search query that they'd sent through from our search box. But what's going to happen if there is no search query from the search box? Because instead of typing in that, they've just selected a category. What we can actually do is just create a condition that'll just recognize if someone's actually searching by a category, not a query, and then we can update this text. So if we open up our conditional tab here, we're going to define a new condition, and we're just going to recognize when the URL parameter, which is called category, when it is not empty, meaning that someone has selected a category that they want to search for. So in order to do that, I'm going to type in the word URL. I'm going to get data from my page URL, and the parameter here will be known as the category. And then from here, I'm just going to recognize when this URL parameter is not empty, meaning that once again, someone actually has performed a search by the category. What I'm going to do is update this text, and I'd now like this to actually display that category that someone has searched for. So I'm just going to add an apostrophe here. I will insert dynamic data once again and type in the letters URL. And now I'm just going to fetch that category from my parameter. So I'm going to once again type in the word category and fetch that parameter. I'll then choose to close this, and I will add in a closed apostrophe. Now that's going to display our category instead of the search query. And we're also going to replicate this exact same experience on our repeating group. So if I select on my repeating group here, I'm going to actually update the data source whenever someone's searching through the category parameter. So I'm going to define a condition, and I'll once again type in the letters URL. And I'm going to once again get data from my page URL, and the parameter name will be my category. And when this is not empty, meaning someone actually is searching by a category, what I'd like to do is update the data source of my repeating group. Now, instead of actually rebuilding this entire data source from scratch, what I'm going to do is head over to my Appearance tab and copy across my existing data source, and then just make a minor tweak to that. So I'm going to right click on my data source and choose to copy this expression. I'll then jump over to my Conditional tab. right click in this data source and now choose to paste that in. And what you'll now see is that that's copied across my entire data source. So within this data source, we're searching for restaurants that are within a certain proximity to a user, and at this point where the name contains the same keyword from the search query. And at this point, this will no longer be relevant. So I'm going to choose to delete this. Instead, what I'd like to do is add an additional constraint and recognize that I only want to display restaurants where the categories contains the same category that someone is searching for from our parameter. So I'm going to once again type in the letters URL, and I'm going to get data from a page URL. And that parameter name is of course called our category. But one thing I should point out is that when it comes to extracting the parameter here, we're actually going to need to update the type of content. And the reason for that is because if we just quickly jump back to our constraint here, we're referencing a category, which is linked to our option set category. And so this category will need to match another category of the same type. So if I just quickly click back into my search here, I'm going to update the type to be linked to our categories option set as well. And if I close this, you'll see that that will validate. And that is everything we'll need to edit when it comes to this condition. And look, that actually wraps up everything I wanted to cover within this section of our tutorial today. So what I'd love to do is just show you a quick preview of how both of these search features are going to function from our homepage and how they're going to send data through to our search results page, which will then be able to see a list of relevant restaurants based on our search query or our search category. Over in a preview of my application here, I'm just going to reduce the size of my browser. And within my search box here, what I'm going to do is search for the word McDonald's. I will hit enter. This search will run. And as you'll now see, it's displaying a list of all of the McDonald's within my application that are within a certain distance to my current location. If I was to then just jump back to my home page, what I could also do is search by categories. So if I wanted to search by restaurants that serve alcohol, I could click on this, it would run that workflow, and as you'll now see, it's displaying a list of all of the restaurants that have the category alcohol listed within them. And of course, as you might remember, La Pasta is one of those restaurants. So as you can see at this point, we've not only created a search feature that caters to a search query, but also a way for users to search by categories, which will just help them discover new restaurants that they might not specifically be looking for. Just jumping back into my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we've finished building out our custom search feature, which in comparison to some of the other features we've built out today, was a fairly straightforward process. Aside from learning how to use URL parameters, there wasn't too many complexities when it came to bringing this feature to life. And unfortunately, that is all I have time to include within this tutorial today. As you can see, we've been building for literally hours, and there's still so many features that I need to cover in as much detail as I possibly can. If you were interested in finishing your Uber Eats clone, I'd always recommend hitting the link in the description of this video, so that way you can get access to the full course. Now, while this full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of time having to learn how to rebuild each of these features from scratch. And so if you want to launch your startup as quickly as possible, this course is going to be the saving grace you need. Within that full course, we're going to cover all of the remaining features, like being able to create restaurant listings, then allowing restaurant owners to list food items for sale within those restaurants, from which we'll then create a dynamic restaurant page so that way our users can actually view the restaurant listings. We'll then create a custom search feature, a custom checkout, the ability to process payments, a restaurant dashboard page, so that way restaurant owners can manage all of their incoming orders, as well as even then a driver's dashboard page, so that way they can accept deliveries and then send those goods to our end customers. And look, the list truly just goes on. There's so much that we need to cover. In the meantime though, if you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button, so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new video on my channel. For now though, I just want to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch up to this point in our tutorial, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.